Members of the Shadowpan faction will sometimes say, "We are the Watchers on the walls," or "We are the sword in the shadows." These are very similar to some of the vows taken by members of the Night's Watch in A Game of Thrones. Also, the Shadowpan themselves have many similarities to the Night's Watch in the series. The gloves is Syriel's gloves of tutelage, and their flavor texts are a reference to the character Syriel Farrell from the show and books. You can find a permanent corpse of a clumsy adventurer at the bottom of a cliff in Negran. Some giant sea turtles native to the southern seas were captured by the Stormreaver clan in the Second War, and were subsequently used by goblin mercenaries as submarines. After the Scourge invasion of Quathalos, which killed about 90% of the elven population, the survivors retreated to Sunstrider Island, the Blood Elf starting zone. Sunstrider Island is the only elven territory that has never fallen to the Scourge. A handful of leper gnomes work with the Forsaken and Lordaeron. They usually work for the Royal Apothecary Society as assistants and apprentices. The toads at the Pools of Purity and Pandaria are references to the old arcade game Battletoads. The quest and achievement, Magnets, How Do They Work, is a reference to the song Miracles by the Insane Clown Posse. A line from the song goes as follows, effing magnets, how do they work? Which became an internet meme. The item, Psychopathic Hatchet, might be a reference to the group's label, which is named Psychopathic Records, featuring a man with a hatchet as their logo. The Scourge archers seen early on in the Death Knight quest chain are called Sky Darkeners, referring to this exchange from the movie 300, where the antagonist tells them that their arrows will blot out the sun, to which the protagonist will then remark, "Then we will fight in the shade." Most, if not all of the old gods are based on creatures created by H.P. Lovecraft. Cthulhu is based on Cthulhu. Yogg-Saron is based on Yog-Sothoth. Also from Yogg-Saron, the Fiend of 1,000 Maws is a reference to H.P. Lovecraft's Shub-Niggurath, the black goat with 1,000 young. Yasharaj, the black goat with 7 heads, which is whispered from Yogg-Saron, is also from H.P. Lovecraft. The black goat in Lovecraft is Shub-Niggurath. N'Zoth is based on Zoth-Amag. The Emerald Dream is based on the Dream State or Cycle of Cthulhu in Dungeons & Dragons. Also, Azeroth is based off of Azathoth, which is also from H.P. Lovecraft. There was a clan on Draenor that never made it to Azeroth called the Lightning Blade Clan, who have a ritual where they try to get hit by lightning. Presumably, the reason they're not around anymore is because of this ritual. There's also a server named after them. If you look on the map of a Horde level 3 Garrison table, you can see the island of Farallon off the coast of Gorgron, which was planned to be in Warlords but was cut from the game, and another island right below Negran. As for the island below Negran, my best guess was that it was just supposed to be the Thundering Isle. In lore, all of the Forsaken ships are actually just old Lordaeron ships dredged up from the bottom of the ocean. Cthulhu, the final boss of AQ40, will whisper the words, "You are already dead, your heart will explode," and Kenshiro, the lead character from the anime Fist of the North Star, is extremely famous for the initial line, and often, through his fighting style, would cause massive internal damage to his opponents, including making their hearts explode in an extremely violent fashion, in which he would say, "You are already dead," before the explosion took place. In Uldaman, there are 3 dwarfs, Olaf, Eric the Swift, and Balog, who are the 3 Lost Vikings from Blizzard's Super Nintendo side-scroller game and playable characters in Heroes of the Storm. Alliance players can get 2 quests involving them, and Horde players are required to kill them to fully complete the instance. Their combat abilities from the original game have been translated faithfully to the Warcraft universe. When killed, Balog drops a sword, Nordic Longshank, and Balog's shortbow. Olaf drops a shield, Olaf's all-purpose shield, which allows the user to float for 10 seconds. And Eric the Swift drops worn running boots and a horned Viking helmet with the ability to charge the enemy, stun it for 3 seconds, and stunning you for a shorter period of time. These abilities are references to the character's unique abilities in the Lost Vikings. There are also 2 items that Alliance players must retrieve in conjunction with the quest The Hidden Chamber, the Shaft of Soul and the Ginnikiv Medallion. These 2 items contain the words Lost Vikings spelled backwards. A Death Knight starter quest, A How to Win Friends and Influence Enemies, is a play on the title of Dale Carnegie's book, How to Win Friends and Influence People, a popular book for learning how to manipulate people. In vanilla, a warrior's recklessness ability had a 30-minute cooldown. It also increased the damage you took while giving you a 100% increased crit chance. Can you imagine a major DPS cooldown with a 30-minute cooldown today? With over 14 million copies sold, WoW is the 2nd best-selling computer game of all time, right behind Minecraft. And I'm pretty sure those numbers are a lot higher today than when I first made this video. Many companion pets have special emotes for when they're out in the open world. Creepy Crate will death grip nearby critters randomly. The Sunblade Micro Defender will randomly send out a shockwave to kill all nearby critters. The fiendish imp will sometimes summon a different imp named Kilrak when summoned, and many, many more, most of which involve killing other critters. In Gorgrond, there is a secret little island with 4 chairs and a campfire. If you click the campfire, it will take you to a cave with the same setup, only on the Timeless Isle. In the entrance to the Mana Tombs, there's an NPC named Slim the Shady Dealer, who isn't very happy about what his name is a reference to. Before mailboxes had 12 slots for items, you used to only be able to mail one thing at a time. The NPC Wildhammer Fact Checker right next to Falstead is based on the red shirt guy from BlizzCon. In Dreadwaste, the buffs from the Calaxy gave different names referencing some heavy metal songs. Black Sabbath, Iron Mantid and Children of the Grave. Slayer, Angel of Death and Radiant Blood. Queensryche, Silent Lucidity. Deep Purple, Speed King. Metallica, Seek and Destroy and Master of Puppets. Manowar, Battle Hymn. Judas Priest, Painkiller. The 2014 BlizzCon cosplay contest winner had a very well done Grand Empress Shexier costume, but it broke apart before she could accept her prize. In game, there is a fairy dragon named after her who will transform into the costume if you talk to it. The Ulduar raid is possibly a reference to the elder god Uldar/Ulthar from H.P. Lovecraft's Cthulhu's mythos. Ulduar was an elder god, similar to the Titans, sent to Earth to keep vigil over the Great Old Ones, which the Old Gods are based on, much like how Ulduar is a prison for the Old Gods. The Keepers in Ulduar are direct references from Norse mythology. Freya is based on Freya. Mimron is based on Mimir. Hodir is based on Hod. Thorum is based on Thor. Oriaya having cats can also be attributed towards Lovecraft, the short story The Cats of Ulthar, where there is a law forbidding the killing of any cats in the town. Loken is based on Loki. The name Algalon appears in the combination of Algol, a bright 3-star system known as the Demon Star, and mentioned in H.P. Lovecraft's Beyond the Wall of Sleep, and Eidolon, which is an astral double of a living being. There is a very subtle How to Train Your Dragon reference in the Horde Frostwall Tavern. The achievement Do a Barrel Roll is a reference to the Star Fox 64. The line, which was delivered by Peppy Hare as advice to the player, became an internet meme. While not quite making it to the Burning Crusade, as it was renamed Gladiator Slicer, the Sword of a Thousand Truths was introduced as a drop in the new Naxxramas, and renamed Slayer of the Lifeless, complete with the flavor text Foretold by Salzamon, which is an obvious nod to the Make Love Not Warcraft episode in South Park. One of the phases of Mimiron is named V07TR0N, a reference to the anime robot Voltron. Additionally, the achievement titled And I'll Form the Head, gained when looting Mimiron's head, is a quote from the show. The quest Jumping the Shark takes its name from the popular expression, meaning that a form of entertainment is declining in quality beyond recovery. Next up, we'll talk about a few Simpsons references for this one fact. There is a quest NPC in Eversong Woods named Groundskeeper Willithin, a reference to Groundskeeper Willie. The skinning trainer in Chatrat City is called Seymour Grandmaster Skinner, a reference to Seymour Skinner, the principal of Springfield Elementary. The Mr. Pinchy item is a direct reference to the lobster that Homer raises and is forced to eat by himself when he accidentally cooks it. Occasionally, one of the children fishing off the docks in Stormwind will yell out that he's caught a big, 3-eyed fish, just like Blinky, the radioactive 3-eyed fish from the series. In the Orc internment camps in the Caverns of Time dungeon Escape from Durnhold, the occasional guard will yell, "I was just taking orders," a reference to the common excuse used by Nazi labor camp guards during the Nuremberg trials. The jewel crafting Cataclysm dailies in Orgrimmar and Stormwind reference characters and events from the series Futurama heavily. In the quest A Present for Leela, Leela has purple hair, is a ship captain, and apparently only has one eye left, but is still attractive, which are attributes from Leela in the show as well. Bonder, or Curver in the Alliance version, is apparently a thief, which his friends are oblivious about, and likes drinking, which describes Bender from the show. In the quest Elemental Goo and the latest fashion, they mention a Professor Barnsworth and Dr. Wernstrom, which are references to Professor Farnsworth and Dr. Wernstrom, rival scientists and mortal enemies. While the latest fashion mentions disregard for the dangers of science/magic, as well as finding other uses for inventions that have proven to be dangerous, a trait of Farnsworth. The hand stuck in the jar joke in Elemental Goo's completion text might refer to the series' heads in jars. The quest Nibbler No, Nibbler is a direct reference to Leah's pet of the same name, which can and will devour and digest anything, while its droppings are too heavy to lift. In reference to the never-ending story, the region Swamp of Sorrows is likely a reference to the Swamp of Sadness, where Treyu loses his horse Artax. The Legend of Stilvan quest chain is partially about a man infatuated with an adolescent girl named Tillua, an anagram of Lolita, the main focal character of the famous novel Lolita. During the First War, the Orcish horde used their own variation of necromancers, the Necrolites. Bishop Natalie Celine of Lordaeron began delving into the workings of their magic in order to provide the Kingdom of Azeroth with assistance. However, over time, she became increasingly obsessed with finding out why such dark energies existed at all. Eventually, she began preaching about the necessity of a balance between light and the shadow. But after her death, her books were locked away by the Kirin Tor. Some Forsaken priests eventually rediscovered her teachings, thus explaining why undead can become priests, and the existence of shadow priests at all. According to Bran Bronzebeard, the Gorlocks of Northrend originate from an unknown frog ancient. The Murlocs then evolved from Gorlocks, infesting Azeroth's waters to this day. Thinking with Portals, a memorandum of proper portal usage, one of the funny books that can spawn instead of real books needed for higher learning, shares a name with the game's catchphrase. And "the cake is not a lie" is a reference to the popular line "the cake is a lie." In the Elwyn Forest are farms owned by two feuding families, the Stonefields and the McClures. This is a reference to the Hatfield/McCoy feud from American history. There's an NPC on the docks of South Shore named Farmer Kent, a reference to either Clark Kent or his adopted father, a farmer who found and raised Superman. The Gill Goblins, goblins who live underwater looting sunken ships, were actually an accidental invention of Hobart Grapplehammer, one of the NPCs in the Goblin starting zone. He's not entirely sure whether it's an accomplishment or a failure. Hobart Grapplehammer also invented Subject 9. Originally a baby raptor from the Barrens, she obtained a very large intellect, made a few babies, built a rocket with the citizens of the player, and left Azeroth in a small quest chain. Following the death of Medivh, his staff, Atiesh, was brought to Dalaran. After several members of the Kirin Tor attempted to wield it and died soon afterwards, the staff was locked up, and a special position was created to watch it. Following the destruction of Dalaran at the hands of Archimonde, the staff shattered, and its pieces were scattered all over Azeroth. Through a complicated chain of events, the staff was eventually reforged by Medivh's son, Madan, and is currently in the possession of Archmage Khadgar. Since launch, WoW has been played collectively for over 6 million years. At the time of making this video a long time ago, it's probably a lot longer now. The achievements granted for killing rares, a worthy opponent, could we find more like that, and glorious are all famous quotes from the Templar Companion in Diablo 3. The achievement Alone in the Darkness is a reference to Alone in the Dark, which is an action-adventure horror game with many references to Cthulhu, similar to Yogg-Saron Encounter as an achievement from. In the cockpit of the Sky Golem, there is a picture of the Queen of Blades. According to an Ask C-Dev, both Ner'zhul and Arthas were holding back from unleashing their full forces there in their respective reigns as the Lich King. If they hadn't, World of Warcraft would be called World of Mindless Zombiecraft, because they probably would have won. Goblins served Deathwing 10,000 years ago, back in the War of the Ancients. They were the ones who made Deathwing's original adamantite armor. Some also served him during his attempt to take over Alterac. The Dreadlords are the first known to experiment with necromancy in Warcraft lore. During the War of the Ancients, a handful of Dreadlords were seen reanimating corpses in the ruins of Siramar. This shocked and disgusted the observant Night Elves, with the exception of Illidan Stormrage, who thought it was totally neato. The largest animal in Azeroth happens to be a turtle, Shen Zin Su. Several thousand years ago, the Pandaran Liu Lang started a journey to explore the world atop Shen Zin Su. He returned to Pandaria every 5 years. And as the turtle grew bigger, more and more Pandaran joined him. After Liu Lang's death, the turtle never returned to Pandaria again. However, it has continued to grow. The white tiger Zuin seems to be a fan of Mortal Kombat. Along with his achievement, Finish Them, he also says, "Test your might," when you accept his quest. The female Pandaran's /dance is based off of the internet meme derived from the song Caramel Dancin'. In Deeprun Tram, there is a leper known by the name of Haggle who walks around and says, 42, 42 what? It could be anything. This is a reference to the Douglas Adams classic where the answer to the ultimate question of life, the universe, and everything is the number 42. Two popular questions to the answer of 42 are, at what number on a certain street in New York City is the club known as Starvio Muller Beta located at? And what do you get if you multiply 6 by 7? As well as, how many roads must a man walk down? There is a wolf pup named Lady, a reference to Sansa Stark's pet wolf running around the blacksmith in Arathi Basin. Mount Blackrock appears to be based on Mount Doom. as they both overshadow the areas surrounding them, Mordor and the Searing Gorge and the Burning Steppes. They both contain giant magma chambers where certain items can only be forged, i.e. in Mount Doom it would be the Ring, whilst in BRD it would be Dark Iron. The Burning Steppes and the Searing Gorge are very similar to Mordor. For starters, Mordor, just like the two zones, is a burning hellhole overshadowed by a giant volcano. There is also evil orcs in both Mordor and the Burning Steppes, who simply want to take things for themselves. Mordor is ruled by Sauron, whilst the Burning Steppes and Searing Gorge are ruled and practiced by Ragnaros, an elemental lord hell-bent on destruction. In Shadowmoon Valley, there is a rare mob called Golrum, who looks very similar to Golem from The Lord of the Rings, and even drops a ring that turns you invisible at a cost. In the quest, It's All Fun and Games, you're asked to destroy the Ocular, which floats above the Shadow Vault spires. The Ocular bears a strong resemblance to the Eye of Sauron atop the tower from The Lord of the Rings Return of the King film. The One Ring is a direct reference to the One Ring to rule them all from Lord of the Rings. Like Smeagol, you find it while fishing. The top of the Firelands raid looks very similar to the Eye of Sauron, and even pulsates if you get too close. In Spies of Iraq, there are 3 ogres sitting around a campfire who are obvious references to The Hobbit, with each of their names slightly different from their Hobbit names, and drop items related to the book. There are 2 characters on Fiona's caravan, Gidwyn the Dwarf and Terranar the Blood Elf. They are references to Gimli and Legolas from Lord of the Rings, and even count their kills like they did in the movies. In New Nagrand, you can find the permanent corpse of the time-lost Protodrake. Joust, the quest in the Firelands Hatchery, plays like a 3D version of the arcade game Joust, including similar-looking enemies and controls. A questline presented by Bud at Bud's Dig in Kepler Forest revolves around a huge shark named Nas, a play on the movie title Jaws. The names of 2 quests are Duh-nuh, and Dun 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 Dun, which are references to the movie's musical theme, imitated with a human voice. An oblique, unsuccessful attempt to kill Nas is to lure it to eating grubs loaded with gunpowder, which explodes when he bites it. A reference to the end of the movie where the shark is killed by an oxygen tank exploding in its maw. Another obscure reference might be the fact that Nas' boneyard is filled with orca remains. The boat in the movie was named after the orca, considered the only natural enemy of the great white shark. In southern Feralis, near the steam pools, you can find a goblin resort. This is where you can find Gordon Tramsey, head chef, which is a clear reference to Gordon Ramsay, who is a famous chef with a whole bunch of cooking TV shows. The quest, A Bone to Pick, references 2 things. The first being in The Simpsons in the episode Treehouse of Horror 3, where Homer attempts to purchase cursed frozen yogurt. The episode features a dialogue repeating and alternating "that's good" followed by "that's bad" set of statements. Both the episode and the quest refer to a cursed item, and second, Pirates of the Caribbean, as there is a cursed treasure that turns anyone who touches it into a skeleton. There's an NPC in the Twilight Highlands called Mia the Rose, which is a reference to the porn actress and WoW player Mia Rose. Rose plays a night elf female. According to Apothecary Renzython in the Blood Elf town of Tranquillion, Murlocs manage to retain their free will in undeath. Their spines are apparently an important component in a potential cure for the plague. This is such a huge plot point in a small little quest chain that it's almost comical that it's never brought up again. In Nagrand, there is a permanent corpse of an aspiring wolf rider next to the bloody corpse of his wolf. There is a scroll besides the dead NPC, and upon clicking it, you will get the following text. It is not enough that the wolf regard you as its master. To ready your wolf for riding, you must break its will completely. Once you've subdued your wolf, you will mount it and ride it to the top of the tallest peak in Nagrand. If your wolf is willful, it will throw you to your death on the mountain slopes. If you survive the peak, the will of your wolf will be broken. Then you can call yourself Wolf Rider. Judging by the NPC's death, you can safely assume what happened. The Wrath of Lich King expansion is almost based entirely on Norse mythology. Valkyrion, a village in southwestern Storm Peaks, and the Lich King's Valkyr are both obvious reference to the Valkyrie, winged maidens whose task is to choose who dies on the battlefield and who lives. Those who die are to become servants of the gods. And as we swap over to Icecrown, we see the villages Ymyrheim and Ilmar was a close Nordic goddess of which very little is known, and Jotunheim, the latter actually being close to Jotunheimer, which is the plane that the giants live in. Jotun actually means giant. This place also serves as a place of trial for Vykrul. They fight each other to the death to see who among them is worthy to join the Lich King's allegiance. The winners of this trial are named the Ymirjar. The warriors picked to die by the Valkyr to serve as servants of the gods are named in Hiryar. There is a Daft Punk reference in the Shrine of Two Moons. There is a trash item that has a reference to Dodge coins. There's a small hidden camp in the dwarf starting zone with a mama, papa, and 2 baby bears who seem to have run 2 dwarfs up a tree. If you stick around long enough, you hear a very long conversation. Way off the coast of Tenaris, deep into the fatigue zone, there is the lost city of Gnomelantis. No one knows why it's there, but many speculate it's where gnomes are made. When Dual Spec was introduced in the Wrath of the Lich King, it cost 1,000 gold to learn, which was a steep price even by Wrath standards. In New Nagrand, there is a literal Easter egg with some weird stuff inside of it, but right next to it is a bottle which will summon a mob called Robin, a reference to the genie from Aladdin played by Robin Williams. Hunters, at the time of making this video back in Warlords of Draenor, were the most popular class to play, with a little over 11% of the players playing them, while monks were the least popular class, with less than 6%. Dreadlords are not fanatically loyal to the Legion like most other demons. Instead, they always compete with each other and work towards gaining more magical powers for themselves. For example, a Dreadlord named Kaluthus stole an Atamal crystal in Netherstorm and went rogue, despite the warnings of his Eridar overlord. On many wanted posters in the game, there is a man in a long trench coat that looks like the character Vash from the popular anime/manga series Trigun. Lurking off the northern shores of Desolace, about a bit into the sea, one can find a rare crab scuttling along the bottom of the reef by the name of Krusty. This little guy is a reference to SpongeBob SquarePants, as SpongeBob works in a restaurant called the Krusty Krab. Hemet Nessinwary and Valgard defenders will occasionally yell, "It's coming right for us!" This is a reference to an early South Park episode dealing with the Second Amendment. It's explained that with the new changes in government, you can only fire weapons in self-defense. Therefore, hunters could illegally shoot anything by claiming self-defense, but only after yelling, "It's coming right for us." One of the ghostly citizens in Daro is called Joseph Dirte. He also makes a comment referencing Bruce Lee's Fist of Fury. The male troll offensive spell cast animation is identical to that of a Hadouken, although more likely the Kamehameha from Dragon Ball Z, which Hadouken is based off of. A cloak called the Emperor's New Cape drops from Emperor Thurison in Blackrock Depths. This cloak is unique in that it is completely invisible. This is a reference to the classic fairy tale The Emperor's New Clothes, in which he's swindled by someone who sells him clothes that aren't real and everyone's too afraid to tell him that he's not wearing anything. The Ravagers in Outlands bears an extremely striking resemblance to the Scrabs in the various Oddworld games. One of the quests in Outlands summons a scripted scene involving a gigantic Fellreaver named Negatron, a nod to the Decepticon leader Megatron. Sharkbait is an item pickpocket off of various Naga in Outland, as well as the Isle of Quel'Donis. This is taken directly from the nickname given to Nemo by his fellow tankmates. The picture used for sharkbait is also a clownfish, just like Nemo. The quote, "just keep swimming," was part of the catchy phrase said throughout the movie by Dory. The description of the archaeology item Skull Drinking Cup, especially the line "so thirsty," is a reference to skulls, one rare safe for work strip of the mostly not safe for work webcomic Ogloff. There is a flower merchant in Dalaran named Aerith Primrose. Aerith is a reference to Aerith Gainsborough, a major character in Final Fantasy VII, who wears a pink and red outfit similar in appearance to that of this NPC and is also a flower seller. A sewer shark named Sega CD is located under the poison vendor in the sewers of Old Dalaran. This is a reference to the game Sewer Shark released on the Sega CD add-on for the Sega Genesis, also known as the Mega CD in European and Asian markets. In Grizzly Hills, there are 4 NPCs located near each other with interesting names. These NPCs in question are one adult female deer named Mother of Bambina, a younger female deer named Bambina, a skunk named Flora, and a small rabbit named Thudder. These 4 are clearly a reference to the movie Bambi. The item Zod's Repeating Longbow has kneel before him in the flavor text. This is a reference to the Superman movie's main villain, General Zod, who makes the President of the United States and later tries to make Superman bow before him with the phrase, "kneel before Zod." Under the Stocktron Brewery in the Spires of Iraq, there is a somewhat hidden passageway down 2 flights of stairs to the basement where laborers are fighting each other barehanded. This is most likely a reference to the Fight Club movie and book. The Smoky Direwolf's flavor text is an obvious reference to the Red Wedding from Game of Thrones. Those of you who watch the show know exactly what this means. In Shadowboon Valley, in a very hard to get cave behind a waterfall, is a rare mob called Hypnocroak, obviously a reference to the Hypnotoad from Futurama. In Vanilla WoW, a rogue's eviscerate didn't scale with gear, but hit crazy hard with its base damage. Because of this, rogues didn't really need gear to do decent damage, and gave rise to the popular gearless rogues in PvP and a lot of montage videos. WoW holds the record for the most subscribed to MMORPG, with a peak of 12 million and over 100 million accounts registered in total. Ungoro Crater is a steep walled valley filled with dinosaurs. Two NPCs here are Willadin Marshall and Holandi Marshall, direct references from Land of the Lost characters Marshall, Will, and Holly. Also, there are crystal pylons, which are red, green, blue, and yellow power crystals, visual references to the crystals used in Land of the Lost pylons. Located in Netherstorm inside of the Ecodome stands Shali Por, which is a reference to the actor and comedian Pauly Shore, who starred in the 1996 film Biodome. The opera event in Garrison plays one of 3 random plays, each one direct references to popular forms of media. The Oz event with Dorothy and her dog Tito, Tinhead, Strawman, and the Lion Roar, and the Evil Crone is an obvious reference to the Wizard of Oz. Romulo and Juliane references the famous Shakespearean play Romeo and Juliet, and the Big Bad Wolf, who sometimes transforms players into Little Red Riding Hood and chases them around, is referencing the children's classic fairy tale Little Red Riding Hood. In the purple parlor on top of the Violet Citadel is a butler named Alfred Copperworth who walks around and sells drinks. This is a reference to Alfred Pennyworth, the butler of Bruce Wayne. Bronjom, Godfather of Souls, is the first boss of the Forge of Souls dungeon. Besides Bronjom being a corruption of the name, James Brown was known as the Godfather of Soul. In addition, the game music changes to a more upbeat melody when the boss is engaged, and his loot and achievement for his heroic mode are references or direct quotes of song titles. In the Howling Fjord, there is a gnome named McGoiver who is building an airplane, which is clearly a reference to MacGyver. In Chatras City, one of the NPCs is named The Rock, Master of Cooking, a reference to Dwayne The Rock Johnson. The Rock's most popular catchphrase was, "Do you smell what The Rock is cooking?" In Stormwind, there's an NPC named Elizabeth Birdsong, who, if you go up to and talk to, will tell you the possibilities are infinite. This is a reference to the game BioShock Infinite. One of the main characters' names is Elizabeth, and the songbird was the guardian of Elizabeth. WoW is the highest grossing video game of all time, with it reportedly making over $10 billion since its release in 2012. Although who knows if Fortnite is beat it by now. And to end off this video, more Cthulhu stuff. The crazed dwarves in the Howling Fjord Whispering Gulch speak of that which must not be named. While it could be a reference to Harry Potter, it might also refer to the King in Yellow from the Lovecraftian worlds together with the various tomes of things men and was not meant to known found therein. The faceless ones are quite similar to descriptions of Cthulhu, and are at least influenced by the mythos. Sometimes they say Shura-nab, Yog-Saron, which is a reference to Shub-Niggurath, another god from Lovecraft's pantheon. The achievement, "In his house he waits dreaming," is a reference to a ritualistic chant of the Cthulhu cult. "In his house at Relay, dead Cthulhu waits dreaming." There are a ton of references in WoW, and I can't think of a place that has more of them in one place than the Undercity. So we'll be going over a short list of all of the references behind a couple of the NPCs from Undercity. First off, we have the Undercity Bankers. In Undercity, the 4 bankers have the last name of Montagu. This is a reference to one of the feuding families in Romeo and Juliet. This is more certainly derived from Mercutio's line, when mortally wounded, "A plague on both your houses." The plague, of course, being the one of undeath. Ophelia is one of the bankers that's a ghost, which can be a reference to Hamlet, seeing as she committed suicide in the play and was already dead. Harbinger Balthazar is a reference to Balthazar, Romeo's servant and trusted friend who serves the Montagu family. He can be found walking around the 4 bankers. There are 2 NPCs named Tyler and Edward, which are obvious references to the Fight Club. They also do not have last names like all other NPCs in Undercity do, which could hint at the fact that they are the same person, like they were in the movie. The undead around them also have names from the movie, such as Marla and Robert. The Guildmaster of Undercity is named Christopher Dracul, clearly a reference to Christopher Lee, who played Dracula more than any other person in film. In the War Quarter, there is a priest named Father Lancaster, named after the priest Lancaster Marin from the Exorcist film. The undead innkeepers in Undercity and in the Silverpine Forest are named Innkeeper Norman and Innkeeper Bates, a reference to the Psycho film's main character, Norman Bates, who ran his mother's hotel. In the Bat Trainer's Alcove, you will find Patrick Garrett. This is a reference to Pat Garrett, who was a lawman in the Old West, and who was a friend of Henry McCarty, better known as Billy the Kid. Garrett eventually shot Billy twice in the back. Standing near Patrick Garrett is the Undercity Flightmaster, Michael Garrett. Although there is no evidence of a family relation between the two, it is assumed that Patrick is Michael's son, then Patrick is the Bat Master's son. This would be a play on words for Bat Matterson, another lawman of the American Old West, William Barclay Bat Matterson. The senior warrior trainer in the undead race is called Christopher Walker, possibly a reference to the actor Christopher Walken. One of the Zeppelin goblins near Undercity is named Hindenburg, which is a reference to the famous crashed German Zeppelin, the Hindenburg. There is an NPC named Theresa that wanders around aimlessly. She is blindfolded and is a mind slave to one of the priest trainers. This is most likely a reference to the blindfolded character of the same name in Fabled The Lost Chapters. The undead ghoul named Algernon is holding a single flower in his only hand. This is a reference to the book Flowers for Algernon. Also, if you do some kind of AoE around him, 2 void elementals will come out. Royal Overseer Bahas of the Undercity Census Bureau may be named for the seminal Goth band. This could be a reference to the German Bahas School of Architecture and Art, which deeply influenced the modernist period. The 3 rogue trainers, Carolyn Ward, Miles Dexter, and Gregory Charles, are a reference to Charles Dexter Ward, the main character in H.P. Lovecraft's horror story, The Case of Charles Dexter Ward. There is an engineer named Franklin Lloyd, a reference to the famous architect Frank Lloyd Wright. There are 2 chemists with Fooly and Cooley in their names. These names are references to the anime series FLCL or Fooly Cooley. In the Blue Moon's odds and end shop, there is Alessandra Luca, whose name is a reference to the Swedish name for Gladstone Gander in the Donald Duck series, Alexander Lucas. The expert alchemy trainer is named Dr. Halbert Halsey. This is a reference to 2 key characters, Herbert West and Dr. Halsey in the novel The Reanimator by H.P. Lovecraft. In the book, Herbert West creates an alchemic substance which can reanimate dead tissues, which he uses to bring back Dr. Herbert. Riley Walker's name is a reference to the book Ridley Walker, a story about post-apocalyptic England. Father Lazarus, 2 possible references for this guy. The first being Lazarus, the guy Jesus raised from the dead in the Bible, and 2, Archbishop Lazarus. In Diablo 1, Lazarus led the townspeople of Turistum into the catacombs of the monastery, which was infested with demons, and he left them behind in the butcher's chamber to be slaughtered. Luther Pickman, a warlock trainer, is a reference to Lovecraft's story Pickman's Model, which was about a man named Pickman who knows far more than he lets on about the undead and the use of dark magic. Arthur Moore's name is a play on Dudley Moore, the actor, and the character he played in the movie Arthur. James Van Brunt is in reference to the British pop singer James Van Blunt. Ganoush is a leper gnome, which is very out of place in Undercity, seeing as he's not really an undead. His name is probably a reference to the TV show MXC, where the caster would often make up names for their contestants with some form of the word Baba Ganoush. Susan Tillinghast's name is possibly a very subtle nod to one of the families in H.P. Lovecraft's story, The Case of Charles Dexter Ward, who had the name Tillinghast. Priests have been, and still are, the only class in the game with 2 healing specs, with each spec being very unique in their healing styles from each other. Holy plays a little bit like another druid, and Disc plays like a paladin, except with bubbles. Priests were the only real healing class in classic WoW. Back in vanilla WoW, most classes only had 1 viable raid spec, and holy priests were considered the healers, but only holy priests. Disc was kinda terrible. 5 months into the Burning Crusade, priests had the unique distinction of having the most popular 31-point talent in the game in the form of Shadow Form, and the least popular 31-point talent in the game in the form of Holy's Lightwell. This was because every Shadow Priest pretty much needed Shadow Form to be viable in anything they did, and Lightwell was a garbage heal with a click requirement that no one ever actually used. Priests are largely based on bishops and clerics from typical fantasy games and lore. In D&D particularly, clerics are versatile fighters, both capable in combat and skilled in the use of divine holy magic. Clerics are powerful healers due to the large number of healing and curative magics available to them. With divinely granted abilities over life or death, they are also able to repel or control undead creatures. Whether the cleric repels or controls undead is dependent on its alignment. It is also the only class to be in every version of Dungeons & Dragons without a name change. Before Wrath of the Lich King, priests had their own racial spells in addition to their baseline racials. Dwarves had Fear Ward, which made them the best priests for Alliance players, since a lot of boss fights had fear mechanics. Undeads had Devouring Plague, which was a little overpowered and acted like a powerful dot on a cooldown that healed you for all the damage it did, kinda similar to how it works in modern iterations. There were other pretty neat ones too, but I find the most interesting is the Blood Elves Consume Magic racial. Basically, they could dispel their own buffs to restore mana. Talk about a dumb racial. If you were mind controlled by a priest from the opposite faction, while under their control, you could receive messages from enemy players. Also, back when CCs lasted their full duration in PvP, it was possible to drown players with mind control by just swimming them to the bottom of a lake. In beta, priest had a sleep spell, which was later removed and then given to druids in the form of hibernate. Also, the disc tree for disc and vanilla had a talent to increase wand damage. It's not that wands did a lot of damage back then either, it's just that disc was really bad. They even had a spell that increased their attack power despite not having any physical attacks. I should add a little correction and update to this. Wands were actually good, I was just wrong when I first wrote this. Most power word spells that priests have today, like power word shield and fort, were called holy words, but later changed because paladins had enough holy stuff in their names, and they wanted to make priests different from paladins. But then once chakra stances were brought into the game, they got their holy word abilities once again. For a short while at the beginning of Cataclysm, when disc priests were given the spell power word barrier for the first time, it was so overpowered that despite being the worst healer by a country mile, every raid stacked as many as they could because they could straight up ignore raid mechanics by just stacking barriers during certain phases. Even after this spell was nerfed into the ground, it was still the best raid cooldown in the game for quite some time, and is still going strong today. In Vanilla WoW, most classes only had one viable spec for raiding. Priests were no exception to that rule, as most went holy to be the healer. But PvP was a different story altogether for Shadow Priests. You see, there were a lot of things going well for Shadow Priests in PvP back then. Fears were kind of overpowered, and took a ton of damage to break before a well-deserved nerf. And Priests had the only instant cast fear in the game at the time. Plus, PvP trinkets only removed certain types of CC instead of everything like they do today. There were 3 reliable ways to break fear, but you had to be an undead warrior with blacksmithing specialization to get them all. But it wasn't just fear. They had heals and offensive and defensive dispels as well, something that still sets them apart in PvP to this day. They also had a talent called Blackout that had a 10% chance every time you did shadow damage to stun the target for 3 seconds. With Shadow Word Pain and spamming Mindflay, you could get procs pretty often, and over for the full 3 seconds every time. In addition to that, despite Mindflay having one of the worst spell power coefficients in the game, it hit really hard baseline, as did Shadow Word Pain. And to top it all off, a fully geared Shadow Priest and Warlord gear had nearly as much health as a fully geared warrior. Banish used to have a ridiculously long cooldown for almost no reason, clocking in at around 30 minutes. To prevent Warlocks from banishing multiple mobs over and over. In Wrath, they changed it so you can only keep one demon banished with no cooldown, like most sane mob control abilities similar to Polymorph and Fear. Lots of abilities in Vanilla WoW had very long cooldowns for almost no reason. For most of Vanilla and BC, the best DPS for Destro was just spamming Shadow Bolt and nothing else. Before Cataclysm, Warlocks had to use soul shards to summon their pets, making stones, or summoning a player. Warlocks needed to farm 30 plus soul shards in order to summon an entire raid. Soul shards also took up backspace, so just like old hunters with arrow pouches, you had to have a soul bag which could only contain soul shards, so Warlocks usually had one less backspace than anyone else. The last talent in the Demonology Warlock tree was Soul Link. It originally split 50% of all damage you took between you and your demon. Then, later in Vanilla, they changed it to 30% of all damage taken by the caster is taken by your pet. And a 3% damage increase for you and your pet, both really strong. Back in Vanilla, Demonology Warlocks had more HP than tanks, and their pets were really good. This, combined with the damage reduction from Soul Link, a Warlock could actually tank some bosses in Vanilla raids, which was called the Ranged Tank, and made it a lot easier for bosses to be taken down. In PvP, a Warlock could simply keep rotation, fear into immolation, drain life with the damage of their pet, Soul Link, and HP. They would take a lot of hits to be killed in this way. Also, Fear took a ton more damage to break in those days than it does today. Warlocks were one of 2 classes with a class mount until Wrath of the Lich King. When you reached level 40, you'd get a quest to talk to Strahd Farsen and Ratchet and receive your mount. The Felsteed's name used to be Nightmare. Warlocks also didn't have to buy Apprentice Riding, which was 90 gold back then. And back in the day, 90 gold was a ton. When Warlocks were first given Curse of Doom, it was unique in the way that it would do absolutely nothing for 59 seconds, but then deal a huge amount of damage and have a chance to summon a Doomguard. The Doomguard was neutral though, and could attack you as well. Curse of Doom was then changed to Bane of Doom, like the Warcraft 3 spell Curse of Doom was based on, which functioned more like a normal dot and dealt damage every 15 seconds for 60 seconds, with a chance to summon a demon fighting at your side. Now, it's just Doom. When you're in Metamorphosis, you replace Corruption with Doom, and it lasts for 1 minute, and each time it crits, you summon a wild imp. And an update for this compilation video, the current iteration of Doom is now an AoE dot that explodes after 20 seconds. Warlocks used to have some more stones they could consume apart from health stones and soul stones. Warlocks had these spells called Fire Stones and Spell Stones, which were added in patch 1.3, sort of like offensive stones. First, they were consumable, and the Fire Stone had a chance on melee attack to deal additional fire damage, and Spellstone removed all magic effects as well as giving you an absorption shield. Then they turned them into weapon enchant-ish equipped items. The stones were a conjured item which you'd put into your offhand slot, so you couldn't use a staff and a stone, which was later moved to the wand slot. The Firestone granted spell crit and increased all damage by direct spells. The Spellstone increased all damage by periodic spells and your haste. Nobody ever used these stones though, because they were not equivalent or even near comparable to the stats of wands. They were removed in Cataclysm. Back when Blackwing Lair was released, there was a boss called Razor Gore the Untamed, who had a chance to drop a really good trinket called the Black Book, which increased your pet's damage and armor by 100% for 30 seconds on use. This combined with 2 other talents that boosted your imp's damage by a lot, a Warlock could sit and watch its imp beat another player in a duel. The Black Book was later changed to increase your pet's attack power by 122 instead. For a while, there was a bug with Warlock Soul Link. Your Soul Link didn't get removed from demons that were enslaved when you applied it to them. So you could enslave a demon, put Soul Link on them, and then let it go. Repeat this with a number of other demons, and all the damage you received would be split between the demons. So not only would this make a rogue's ambush deal next to no damage to you, but the rogue would aggro all demons around him that were linked. Soul Link / Siphon Life Warlocks were one of the most overpowered specs in the game during the Burning Crusade, where you'd combine Soul Link from the Demonology tree with Siphon Life from the Affliction tree, along with some other talents to boost their effects. Siphon Life worked like the pet ability of the same name, which was basically a dot that took the damage it dealt and gave it to the caster as health every 3 seconds for 30 seconds. A Warlock would simply run into a battleground, apply Siphon Life, Corruption, and Curse of Agony on any target they could find, then proceed to use Drain Life and Fear. The healing from Siphon Life and the damage reduction from Soul Link made Warlocks almost unkillable. At the same time, their dots would be dealing a ton of damage, and the Warlock could reapply them whenever they felt needed. SL Warlocks 2 comps were a thing to be feared, but to be fair, there were quite a bit of other powerful classes in BC PvP, so it all balanced out as long as you were playing one of those overpowered classes. With Garrisons, a lot of the followers and missions are references to random stuff, just like many things in WoW, with the Leroy Jenkins follower being the most obvious. In this video, we will list about 10 of these things. Millhouse Manastorm is a reoccurring character in WoW and kind of a joke. He first appears in the BC dungeon, the Alcatraz, where you can try to set him free and he'll help you with the encounter while frequently saying quite amusing things. Then he appears again in Stonecore, casting Impending Doom right before getting killed by the Stone Stake. Then he appears again as a rank 8 boss in the Brawlers Guild in Mist of Pandaria, finally as a follower in Warlords of Draenor. Many of the missions you can send your followers on are basically just puns and references that they make the missions based on. For example, the mission Path of the Titans is a direct reference to a system Blizzard announced with Cataclysm that was supposed to give your character a lot of different ways to be customized as well as tied into archaeology in some way. The mission itself takes place in a Cataclysm zone and even mocks the concept in the mission description. There's also the Burning Crusade, a mission with a 100% success chance no matter who you send, obviously referencing the fact that Warlords is like the Burning Crusade expansion. Gone with the Wind, a pun on Gone with the Wind, a famous book and movie, and Twisting the Nether, a pun on the name Twisting Nether, where all the demons come from. There is a female human you can recruit follower from the inn named Mina Kunis. She is a reference to Mila Kunis, one of the few celebrities that's publicly stated that she plays WoW. There is a secret cave under your fishing shack with a skeleton and a treasure box of Garrison supplies. Your first follower when making a Garrison is the Tauren and Night Elf from the opening cinematic from Vanilla WoW. When you use Olin, the Tauren, as a patrol during an invasion, he has the flavor text, "Let me sprinkle some dust on that while fighting," which is a clear reference to him in the opening. There are 2 items you can get through missions which you can use to teach your followers a new trait, the secondary stats, Dancer and Hearthstone Pro. The Dancer trait comes from the mission, the Dance Studio, Northrend Academy of Dance, a reference to the Dance Studio, a feature Blizzard said would be in Wrath of the Lich King, and was even on the display box as a feature, but was never actually implemented. The Dancer trait allows you to counter danger zones, making it the only trait that can counter an ability and has the potential to give a follower 3 counters instead of the 2 you get for being an epic follower. Hearthstone Pro trait comes in the Hearthstone Tournament mission, which just increases the experience gains for all followers on the same mission by 35%. I should also mention that these 2 items will replace a trait, not add a new one. So I wouldn't recommend using them on followers with good traits like Epic Mound or Scavenger, as it replaces one of those traits at random. When you send your followers on a mission, you can watch them actually leave your garrison to go on their missions. A lot of the follower skills and traits have funny descriptions. The Alliance follower Fiona is the same Fiona from the Eastern Plaguelands quest chain of Fiona's Caravan. Alexei Barov and Weldon Barov, 2 followers you can find randomly under a tree if you have a lumber mill, are one of the many callback followers who appear in the game. That is, NPCs who appeared at some point in the game somewhere else. Let's go over Alexei Barov as an example. Before Cataclysm, Alexei was a quest giver in the Tearsfall Glades, and has him help you get the Barov family fortune going into Skullomance and killing his brother. On the Alliance side, his brother pretty much asks you the same thing. In Cataclysm, they stopped trying to kill each other and instead appeared as quest givers side by side, asking to get rid of the Scourge from their former home. With Mists of Pandaria and Skullomance becoming a heroic dungeon, they just straight up disappeared. In Warlords, they decided to become business partners and immediately betrayed each other once they got to Draenor by dropping a giant log on one another. Once you have Alexei as a follower, he hangs on your lumber mill and sells spring-loaded spike traps, even though he can't actually be assigned to the lumber mill as a worker. Alexei Barov is also the undead shown in the Eastern Kingdom's loading screen from Wrath of the Lich King. Pet battles are based on the popular video game series Pokemon, although pretty much everyone knows that considering Pokemon's popularity. There are some pretty big differences though. In Pokemon, each type has multiple types and disadvantages. In WoW, there is only one advantage and disadvantage for each type. In Pokemon, you fight in teams of 6 with 4 moves to choose from. In WoW, you fight in teams of 3 with only 3 moves to choose from. In Pokemon, you have a huge roster of moves to learn or teach your Pokemon, and in WoW, your pets can only learn 6 moves total. All in all, pet battles are an extremely simplified version of Pokemon. There are some pets that are only available during certain weather conditions, times of years, or times of day. The Silithid hatchling are only available during sandstorms in Tanaris. The Korarji Guardlings is only available in the summer, the Snowy Owl in the winter, and the Restless Shadeling can only be caught in the early morning. There are unique special abilities that only certain rare pets have, as a way to make it worth getting them. Some of these special abilities are not all that great, but some are downright overpowered. One of the more notable examples of this is the Haunt ability of the Unborn Valkyrie. Before Warlords, only the Valkyrie had this ability, which is one of the strongest dots in the game, gives you a free switch, and makes you immune to all AoE damage, all in one. The Unborn Valkyrie is a rare spawn in Northrend, and its spawn locations are still camped to this day, even after the inclusion of other pets, which also give you the Haunt ability much easier. Also, another little tidbit on Haunt, if you're going against an undead pet who's in its turn of immunity, and you have your Haunt off cooldown, and you're faster than your opponent, you can use Haunt to dodge damage for the turn, because it will count you as dead, then bring you back to life immediately at the end of the turn, without making Haunt go on cooldown. The Celestial Tournament is the hardest PvE challenge you can do in pet battling. You must defeat 3 tamers who all have legendary quality pets, as well as the 4 celestial boss pets who take 50% less damage from everything, without being able to heal or revive your pets. You also need at least 15 max level pets to even enter, but that's probably not enough pets to even complete the tournament, unless you were really lucky and just happened to level the best pets to counter the bosses on your first go. And in fact, even after updating this video over 10 years after this video first went live, this is still the hardest pet battle challenge in the game. Undead pets have the best racial out of all the pets. The undead racials allow you to come back to life and be immune for 1 turn before dying again. Why does this make the racials so good? Well, say you have 1 health left and your opponent is faster than you. All you have to do is hit with any damaging move and you die without being able to do anything in that round. The undead racial would then make it so that you would survive the turn to get off your attack, then have a free turn after that to get off another ability. essentially giving you 2 more rounds to attack where all other pets would have just died. The mechanical racial is nearly as strong, as it allows you to come back to life with 20% health, but 20% health is usually low enough to just get killed by a basic attack, and if you're slower than your opponent, you only get 1 free turn to attack after coming back alive, instead of 2 like the undead. Pets are separated by pet breeds. There are only 4 stats in pet battling: health, power, speed, and balance, which is just a combination of the other 3. Pets are then given a combination of these 2 stats, which we'll call their breeds. Let's say, for example, we have a power type pet. That just means it'll use all of its extra stat points into power and nothing else. Here's where this gets tricky. Let's take the same pet, only it's a power speed breed. If you had 20 points to spend, it will only spend 18 of them, 9 into power and speed each, and just not use those remaining 2 points. While the pure breed power pet would get to use all 20 of its points in power. This means half-breeds actually just straight up have less stats overall than pure breeds, but it's even worse for balanced pets. Say you take the exact same pet in this scenario, only it's a balance type. It will put all 5 points each into power, speed, and health, only using 15 points out of 20. To sum it up, pure breeds have the most stats, half-breeds have slightly lower, and balance have the lowest. And the only way to see breeds is with an add-on in-game. Terrible Turnip and the Molten Corgi are the only 2 pets in the game with the ability that will not allow you to kill the pet you're attacking: Super Bark and Weakening Blow. These abilities are very useful for catching pets in the wild, seeing as you don't actually have to worry about accidentally killing the lower level pets. While not specifically stated in their abilities, there are some attacks that will hit targets who are unhittable in the air with abilities like Lift Off, or underground with abilities like Dive or Burrow. Using an ability like a Meteor Strike or Launch allows you to hit other pets in the air with similar abilities like Lift Off or Proto Strike. And Quake and Whirlpool can hit underground targets like pets using Submerge, Dive, or Burrow. Frogs can permanently polymorph if the stars align. Frogs have an ability called Frog Hiss, which has a 25% chance every time it hits to polymorph the target for 1 turn. Polymorph essentially works like stuns in PvP. It's not broken on damage and prevents them from attacking. After being subject to a hard CC like a stun, poly, or sleep effect, you get a 2-turn resilient buff which makes you immune to CCs for 2 turns. The thing is though, the buff only gets applied when the CC wears off, so it's entirely possible for the Frog Kiss ability to reapply the polymorph on the already polymorphed target, over and over until the pet dies. It's a low chance, but possible. The highest I've ever seen was 3 turns in a row personally, and this was done to me. In the footage you're watching on screen, I got 2 back-to-back polymorphs in a row, which is pretty rare in itself. This was such a problem that eventually the ability got nerfed, and they just gave it a 1-round cooldown so you can no longer chain polymorph kisses. However, they did nothing else to compensate for the ability, so it's actually just really bad now. The ability Flurry is very unique compared to its counterparts. The ability allows you to hit 1 to 2 times for minor damage, plus an additional time if you're faster than your opponent, for a grand total of 3 potential hits. The thing is though, there are about 10 other abilities in the game that do the exact same thing. Word for word, damage for damage, with the only difference is that sometimes it has a different ability damage type. There's even another ability that does the same thing and damage of the same damage type, Flank, which also does critter damage just like Flurry. So why is Flurry unique? Well, because it's coded differently. Flurry has a potential to hit 3 times, and each time it's going to hit, the game rolls an in-game die to see if it will hit or not all 3 times, in addition to the rolls to see if it will do those extra hits or not. The thing is though, the ability has a 100% chance to hit, so you'd never know it worked this way until you were debuffed by a hit reduction ability. Also, every single other multi-hit ability does not work this way. All the other ones simply roll a dice once to see if it will hit, then rolls the other metaphorical dice to see if it will hit extra times. This seems like not a big deal until you take the popular PvP ability Decoy into consideration. Decoy is an ability which blocks 2 attacks on an 8-round cooldown. Since it blocks 2 attacks, it essentially gives a user a free round of taking no damage, if you take into account the turn it takes to use the ability. It also forces your opponent to actually attack you twice. Since your opponent uses a turn to set up a defensive ability or heal, those are turns that Decoy stays in play, and the pet has protection. One of the most popular pets in PvP uses this ability, and a properly timed Decoy can win the game. Or just simply using it on cooldown. Now, this is where Flurry comes in. Since Decoy only blocks 2 attacks, and Flurry has potential to hit 3 times, it can eat up 2 of the blocks and still hit 1 additional time on the same turn. seeing as it does 3 small attacks. Every single other multi-hit move would simply stop on the first block and not continue, because of the way they're coded to only roll its hit chance once, making Flurry the only multi-hit move in the game that's a decoy breaker. It's called this because Flurry can take out a decoy in 1 turn, where other multi-hit abilities have to take 2 turns. Not only can it take it out a turn, but it can also still do some damage on the turn it takes it out, while the other multi-hit moves would just block for 2 turns of doing 0 damage. But on top of being a decoy breaker, it's also critter damage, which does extra damage to undeads, the most popular type of pet in PvP. This is why Flurry is the best multi-hit ability in the game, and the reason pets with the ability are just straight up better than others, and a big reason why rabbits are still some of the best pets in PvP. Garrison looked completely different. It was modeled after a Chinese-style castle instead of a more medieval European look that it has today. The model in the alpha wasn't even close to finished. Only the outside had color to it, and it was on an elevated platform, so you couldn't even get to it. Also, Deadwind Pass was a lot more rockier with tons of spikes. Just like in vanilla, there were a few places that could be reached in the world that players weren't really supposed to go to. One of those was Programmer's Island. In Programmer's Island, there isn't much, just a random temple, a tower, some boxes, a giant hole with water sound effects if you get close enough, and some words spelled out on the floor. The ones below the giant hole simply spell out fast. The ones to the right spell out the sentence, "Chow is my love monkey." We've also got another place simply called On Map Dungeon, which is just what something is called when it has no name. This place far off the coast of Kalimdor has many human houses of all the shapes and sizes they come in the game. Off to the side, there are more houses, and underwater, more houses still. Not sure why there's so many houses underwater. Of course, that wasn't even the only place with underwater houses. In a completely different part of Kalimdor off the coast is this row of houses. The only real difference here is the larger than normal amount of them, and the fact that these ones are all the same. I've heard rumors that this was supposed to be a test neighborhood for player housing, but there's no real credit to any of those rumors. Although these rumors were actually a lot more plausible than we thought, as we did get confirmation years later that they were definitely testing player housing. There were 2 islands that didn't make it to live in the alpha. The first being the island of Dr. Lapis. The entire island looks like a troll dungeon, has a random tower that's fully detailed inside, and a random ghost town with all the buildings looking like the houses in the undead starter zones, full of skeletons. I assume this was just supposed to be a creepy place. Gilligim's island, same thing, looks like troll dungeons, has a dead turtle on the beach, same model as the turtle submarines used in Warcraft 2, even big enough to go inside, also crashed ships from Warcraft 2. And a decomposing body of a sea monster. All of these are definitely just references to Warcraft 2, so maybe it was going to have some lore associated to it. See this giant desert? That's Oldham. As you can see, there's nothing there. But there wasn't anything in there on vanilla either, just a gate blocking it off. Winter Spring was all green. Easy enough to understand, turning it white later on seems like it's an easy thing to do, and green is easy to work with since it stands out so much more. But funny enough, all the trees and rocks in the zone do have white snow on them already, which makes sense because they were probably just snow assets. The famous Help Easter egg in the Stone Talon Mountains was in the game since Alpha, but is no longer in the game today after Cataclysm. The entrance to the Caverns of Time looks a little different. It looks more like the entrance to a hidden fortress than just the opening to a cave. Ironforge in Alpha was way larger than it was in Vanilla, and even had a second level to it. Also, the center of Ironforge is a giant metal machine. Undercity is also a lot different. The quarter where the auctioneers are located is filled with slime, with bridges leading to the out sections where the trainers and vendors are located. In the outer quarter, there is an easier to access second level of Undercity, as well as what looks like vendor stalls, which meant Blizzard probably had some plans to actually use the second level of Undercity. It's still there today, just kind of hidden and hard to get to. Also, the elevators are in different locations. Stratholme was going to be an outside zone. Blizzard turned it into a dungeon later on in development cycles. Also, the Naxxramas was going to be inside Stratholme, just like how Molten Core was inside Blackrock Depths, and Blackwing Lair was near Upper Blackrock Spire. Blizzard was trying to make it a thing where raids were inside dungeons. Luckily, they stopped trying to do that. There was a random Statue of Liberty off the coast of Stranglethorn Vale. And behind the Gilnean wall, there was surprisingly nothing. The content behind the wall wasn't really added until Cataclysm anyway, it was just blocked off, kinda like Oldham. Zul'jin, the leader of the Amani trolls who allied themselves with the Orcish horde during the Second War, who went around to all the troll villages and challenged each leader to feats of strength and won each of them in order to unite the forest trolls, last boss of the Zul'Aman raid in BC, was a very flamboyant shop owner in the ill-fated Warcraft point-click adventure game. In the Valley of the Four Winds, under the steps in the Imperial Granary, you can find a mesmerizing fruit hat. Put it on while you're in your garrison, and your characters will dance around with the fruit hat for hours. And a Congo line in your garrison of NPCs will start to follow you around. Lei Shen was kind of a big deal in lore. He defeated Raden, the Titan Keeper who created the elemental planes and imprisoned the 4 elemental lords, including Ragnaros, absorbed his power, conquered all of Pandaria, and defeated one of the August Celestials in a one-on-one fight. Each August Celestial is equivalent to an ancient, including Malorn, Aviana, Sonaris, etc., etc. Lei Shen just eventually died of old age, and what we fought in Pandaria was him resurrected. But actually, an update to this video, we got a new ending for Lei Shen where he was actually killed by the machine created to destroy all life on Azeroth, just in case the old gods took over. Corvus, a mushroom vendor in Orgrimmar, actually plays a part in WoW lore. After the events of the Cataclysm, and before Garrosh bombed Theramore, Malkorok and a group of Kor'kron soldiers went to Corvus's mushroom shop in the Cleft of Shadows to punish him for merely disagreeing with Garrosh's plans. When Corvus told them that his shop was closed, Malkorok replied that they were not there for supplies, they were there for him. He was then taken into custody, where he was beaten and then returned to his shop to display what happened to people who don't agree with Garrosh. Then, in the book War Crimes, during Garrosh's trial, he is called upon by Bane to show the past event of Malkorok going to Razor Hill Inn and killing one of the undead and Blood Elf generals for mocking Garrosh. Usually, if a character is given a name in-game, there is probably a reason for it. There is a secret second level in Undercity that you can only get to by flying. In Alpha WoW, there were plans to have shops and vendors up there, and there was an actual ramp to get there, but it's mostly just empty now. In the Pools of Vision in Thunderbluff, they are occupied exclusively by Forsaken, and is the only place in Thunderbluff with no Tauren NPCs. The pools are said to deliver messages from the dead, and the Tauren place such a strong emphasis on the value of life, so they don't really like the Forsaken being there, and only begrudgingly let them stay there because of their alliance. You also couldn't mount inside the Pools of Vision until late Wrath of the Lich King, despite it being part of a major city. In Silithus, there were the remains of a bronze dragon named Grakron, who was killed in the War of the Shifting Sands by the Anubisath. The thing is though, most Anubisaths are kind of dumb, but one of them was smart enough to throw its sword into the dragon's wing to take it down. He was then nearly mauled to death as his allies came and finished off the dragon on the ground and taken back into the city, where Cthulhu himself fixed him up and gave him power. And that's the last boss of AQ20, Osarion the Unscarred. Drekthar, the general and final boss for the Horde in the AV Battleground, is a blind old man in a wheelchair now. All AV battles actually take place in the past, where Drekthar can still see and walk. Drekthar also holds a distinction of being the only person in-game in a wheelchair. See these 2 islands right here in the vanilla WoW cinematic? Well, they're not in the game, but they were in the Alpha WoW as the island of Dr. Lapis and Gilligam's Island. Elune is one of the few true deities of Azeroth. That is, one of the few gods known to actually exist, and is widely believed to be the mother of Sonaris. Even after meeting the sister of Elune, we still don't exactly know who she is. Ngoro crater is most likely directly based on the Ngorongoro crater in Tanzania. The Ngorongoro crater is the world's largest inactive, intact, and unfilled volcanic caldera. Gorefiend probably has the record for the most deaths in WoW lore. Being the first Death Knight, he was introduced with 1 death, then died again in Warcraft 2, was brought back to life and became a boss in Black Temple for no reason and died a 3rd time, then dies a 4th time in Hellfire Citadel as Gorefiend. He was also defeated at the end of the Auchendoom dungeon, but wasn't actually killed. Originally, World of Warcraft only had 6 races. Trolls and gnomes were added in later development. In Vanilla WoW, a top raiding guild once lured the world boss Kazak into Stormwind, who had an unlimited range AoE Shadow Bolt that one-shot when enraged. By the time it was kited to Stormwind, it was very obviously enraged, and one-shot everyone in Stormwind. Every time he killed someone, he healed up a little bit, so it was almost impossible to kill it. And Kazak killed all the NPCs as well as the players in Stormwind. It got so bad that Blizzard had to actually reset the server to put Kazak back where he came from, and then gave him a maximum follow distance. Priest once had a bug that basically allowed them to scale vertical cliffs. If they caught themselves on an edge and cast Levitate, you could continuously creep up as far as you wanted. When Burning Crusade first came out, hunters could misdirect to friendlies in neutral goblin cities and attack the guards, making the guards kill the misdirected target. There used to be a bug where the shaman's Fire Nova totem would do damage to friendly players if you logged out while it was out. This allowed shamans to kill low-level players in major cities of their own faction. Originally, Outland was going to be a zone included with Vanilla WoW. That's why it was possible to glitch into an unfinished version of Hellfire Peninsula in Vanilla WoW. Forsaken, created after the Cataclysm, are just random humans raised by Sylvanas, and not citizens of Lordaeron like what made up most of the Forsaken before the fall of the Lich King. The Abyssal Maw raid was supposed to be an underwater raid in Cataclysm, and even has its own raid entrance in-game, but was never actually implemented. People have been able to dig up what Blizzard had made of the raid before they scrapped it, and it seemed like it was going to be an entirely underwater raid. With how much players complain about the underwater zone of Ashir, it's no wonder they scrapped this unique idea. And later on, we got confirmation that this is exactly what happened. If you're flying past the fatigue zone in the ocean, eventually you'll come up against the end of the zone. Except in Gorgrond. If you fly in the ocean, where Faerlun was supposed to be, and where it was in early Warlords Alpha builds, the ocean just goes on, way longer than anywhere else in the game. Meaning they simply removed the island and replaced it with water. So there's just a giant, huge empty space of water off the shore of Gorgrond where Faerlun was supposed to be. In Wrath of the Lich King, there was a quest mob wolf who would transform into a Worgen lookalike model during its fight. If you timed your tame beast to finish as soon as it transformed, it actually stayed in its Worgen form permanently. So for a little while in Wrath, hunters could have half Worgen as pets. The Worgen pet had all the same moves as a wolf, so it was totally fine to raid with, since at the time, wolves were the #1 pet for DPS anyway. In Vanilla WoW, when gold sellers still actually farmed gold in-game to sell, the most used class for gold farming was BM hunters. The last tier for BM healed you for a tiny bit every time your pet did damage, and hunters were mostly an auto attack class anyway, so they didn't have to worry about running out of mana. So those gold farmers would just farm satyrs in Ajara 24/7 without needing to take breaks. There was a bug that lasted for quite some time where the snakes from the hunter's snake trap ability could attack other players from the opposing faction, even if they were not flagged for PvP. Blizzard did not respond to crazy bugs like this as fast as they do today, so this glitch actually lasted for a while. Hunters only have 3 available aspects today, and you need a glyph to get the 3rd one. But did you know hunters have actually had a total of 10 aspects in their history? In addition to the ones you can get today, Cheetah, Pack, and Beast, there was Monkey, which gave you an increased dodge, Hawk, which gave you attack power, Iron Hawk, which also gave you attack power but at the same time reduced the damage you took, Dragon Hawk, which was an aspect in Wrath which combined the effects of both aspect of the Monkey and Hawk, Viper, which gave you a ton of mana but lowered your damage, Wild, which gave everyone in your raid nature resistance, and Fox, which allowed you to cast while moving before it was a baseline. You couldn't lay traps in combat until the Burning Crusade. All traps shared a cooldown, and you had to feign death to trap in combat. Only if your pet was still attacking, you stayed in combat, so only skilled hunters could combat trap. Some pets kept special abilities after being tamed in vanilla, like the Frost Wolves from AV who could run at 255% speed and catch up to mounted players. Broken Tooth, a rare cat, which had a 1-second attack speed, making him one of the fastest attacking things in the game, and a nightmare for casters to deal with in PvP. In the Burning Crusade, your rotation could be macroed into one button. The rotation consisted of spamming Steady Shot in between your auto shots and using Kill Command when available, since it wasn't on the global cooldown and could only be activated after a crit. Also, it wasn't an attack but a pet buff. If a hunter got tired of only pressing one button, they could bind it to their scroll wheel, or put the macro on multiple buttons to make it seem like they had more to do. Pets in Vanilla WoW had loyalty in addition to happiness. If a pet was happy, it did 25% more damage. Unhappy, it did 25% less damage. But if your pet stayed unhappy too long, it would also start losing loyalty points. And if you lost too many loyalty points, it would run away. Your pets would lose happiness by just being out and existing. So going AFK with your pet was generally a bad idea. Pets didn't go away when you mounted, and didn't run as fast as your mount. So if you outpaced it, the pet would despawn and lose happiness. Until Cataclysm, hunters were the only class that had to pay for every shot they fired. Pretty much every ability you used consumed ammo, so every wipe cost you more than the average raider, since you were paying gold to use all of your abilities. In Vanilla WoW, only 3 classes had normal resurrection spells: priests, shamans, and paladins, so 2 classes per faction, since shamans were horde only and paladins alliance only. Warlock Soulstones used to only resurrect if you placed it on a player before they died. It was changed to a true battle resurrection in Cataclysm. It can still be used in its classic way, however. Druids did not gain a true resurrection until partway through the Burning Crusade. Before then, they only had a battle resurrection. In Warcraft 3, resurrection was an ultimate ability of paladins that would bring back to life the most powerful 6 friendly units nearby who died. So the first res was kind of a mass resurrection. There were only 4 classes that can battle res currently: Death Knights, Warlocks, Druids, Hunters with a Moth, Crane, or Quillin pet, which was later removed and now it's not this case anymore. Hunters are the only class to have their very own pet resurrection ability, which revives their pet. Other pet classes do not have a revive pet option because they can just simply resummon a new one. It used to be an extremely effective strategy to stack the raid with battle reses. This was nerfed in Mists of Pandaria to have a limit of battle reses per raid size. In World of Draenor, this was changed slightly, so raid sizes would gain a charge of battle reses based on the size of your group. Shamans are the only class that can self-resurrect, and this res does not count towards the battle res charges. The downside is that it has a very long cooldown, and does not reset with other abilities after wipes. Death Knights in Wrath of Lich King used to be able to resurrect other players and self-resurrect as ghouls, which they could play as. These ghouls had their own attacks and only lasted for a limited time. A spell data mined in the Legion Alpha called Arise and Serve will give Warlocks the ability to res themselves with their battle reses, similar to a Warlock soul-stowing themselves before a fight. It's rumored that it might be added to the Frost Death Knight artifact weapon as a trait. Currently in the Legion Alpha, Frost Death Knight artifact weapon will allow them to use their battle res on themselves. As an update, this ended up not happening. Engineers have 3 items that allow them to attempt to resurrect fallen players: the Goblin Jumper Cables with a 33% success rate, Goblin Jumper Cables XL with a 50% success rate, and the Gnomish Army Knife with a 66.7% success rate. They later on added a lot more other resurrection abilities for every new expansion. The Darkmoon card Twisting Nether gave players a 10% chance of being able to self-res back in Vanilla WoW. It was even used in arenas until it was nerfed in late Wrath to not count the player res by it to be counted as alive, meaning if you're doing 2s and they kill your partner after you res the trinket, you'd still lose. You can still technically use the trinket today, as while doing research for this video, I've read reports of it still working even at level 100. Molten Core was one of the first raids in WoW. Blizzard did not expect players to have one player stand in the back and never enter combat, so they could resurrect mid-fight. Blizzard would later patch MC to have bosses aggro everyone in the raid. After Molten Core, Blizzard would make better aggro from bosses to prevent players from doing this again. Mass Resurrection was introduced in Cataclysm and gave every class the ability to resurrect if they were in a guild. In the Cataclysm beta, Mass Res cost mana, meaning rogues, warriors, hunters, and death knights could not use it. Also, in the Burning Crusade Alpha, Paladins had Mass Resurrection for a short time. This makes sense considering the Warcraft 3 ult for Paladins. Currently, in Live, all specs of Druids, Priests, Paladins, Monks, and Shamans can resurrect, but can only resurrect one player at a time. In Legion, only Resto Druids, Dis/Holy Priests, Holy Paladins, Mistweaver Monks, Resto Shamans will be able to res, and this is a mass res with no cooldown. Combat Resurrection remains unchanged. Before patch 3.08, not all races could use all mounts. Taurens on Raptors, Night Elves and Mechanostriders, you didn't see any of that in the vanilla or BC. Now everyone can use just about any mount. Before Mists of Pandaria, some classes had 4 weapon slots: main hand, offhand, ranged weapon, and or ammo, or one of the class-specific items like totems or shamans. In Dalaran, there's an NPC named Wendell Sparkshine, who will go around Dalaran at night and turn on all the lights with his wand. After he's finished, you can buy a Wendell's lighter from him, which will allow you to turn on the lights that he may have missed. In Vanilla, there's a trash item called Nat Pagel's Guide to Extreme Angling, which only has the last page that says, and so that's where you'll find the legendary sword of the Scarlet High Lord, Ashbringer. Ain't it amazing what you run into in an ordinary day of fishing? Which led players to believe you could get the Ashbringer from fishing. Little do they know, all they do was wait for Legion where everybody got an Ashbringer for free. Also, the hidden skin for the Ashbringer heavily references this little rumor. There were plans in the original honor system to have a rank for City Protector, which you could only have for 1 week and gave you a spell to teleport to the capital city. It was never put in though, but seems like it would have been a neat idea. There were also planned titles to go along with getting the rank for a week, but that was all replaced with the High Warlord system they had in Vanilla instead. Enemy player cast bars weren't visible in Vanilla, so players could cast their Hearthstone to try and bait out interrupts. Buffs weren't visible either, Mages had a detect magic spell to see buffs in PvP. In order to level a rogue's lockpicking skill back in the day, you had to go around the world and open footlockers, which were items put in secret locations and specifically for rogues to level their lockpicking. You could also open lockboxes found in random monsters, but it was infinitely more efficient to go into open world and just open footlockers over and over instead. Loading into a battleground in vanilla didn't automatically put everyone into a group, so you had to form one yourself once it started, similar to Ashran. Ragnaros used to melt your weapons, making them break faster than normal, causing people to actually carry extra weapons / repair bots on progression attempts. If you walk into ICC with the corrupted Ashbringer equipped, all the paladins of the Argent Crusade will attack you, including Tyrion Fordred. Intellect used to increase your chance to gain skills up with weapons, back when you had to do that sort of thing. So it wasn't too far-fetched of an idea to buy a bunch of intellect gear off the auction house and go into the world and attack low-level mobs all day to skill up your swords to use your new weapon. A copper bar sells for 10 copper. A silver bar for 1 silver. Want to guess what a gold bar sells for in WoW? That's right, 6 silver. At least the trash item solid gold coin sells for 1 gold. Makes you wonder why a bar of gold is worth less than 1 gold coin. The Burning Crusade was the last expansion where priests had their own racial abilities. For those of you who don't know, priests used to have extra racials in addition to their normal ones. Like, for example, how priest dwarves knew how to use Fear Ward, meaning other races of priests couldn't use the ability, and other classes of dwarves also didn't have the ability. Let's go over a little summary of all of them. Undead priests had Touch of Weakness and Devouring Plague. Touch of Weakness was a debuff that would activate when the priest attacked, and Devouring Plague was a strong dot that healed you on a cooldown. Trolls had Shadow Guard and Hex of Weakness. Shadow Guard was like a shadow version of Lightning Shield, and Hex of Weakness was a debuff that lowered damage by a tiny amount and reduced healing by 20%. It was also the priest's only curse effect in the game. Blood Elves had Touch of Weakness and Consume Magic. Touch of Weakness was the exact same as the Undead racial, and Consume Magic allowed the Blood Elf to dispel one of its own buffs to restore mana, and only one of the buffs they cast on themselves. So Power Word Fortitude, Inner Fire, and Touch of Weakness were the only buffs that could be consumed. Night Elves had Star Shards and Allune's Grace. Star Shards was a dot with a cool looking effect, and Allune's Grace was like a mini evasion, in that it increased your chance for things to miss you while it was active. Dwarves had 3 racials in BC, only because Fear Ward was one of the racials at the start of the expansion and was taken away from them and made baseline towards the end, so they were given a new one. The other 2 racials dwarves had were Desperate Prayer and Chastise. Desperate Prayer was an instant cast self-heal on a very long cooldown, and Chastise was pretty similar to Holy Word Chastise that Holy Priests have today, in that it did a tiny bit of damage and incapacitated the target for a bit. Humans had Desperate Prayer and Feedback. Desperate Prayer was the same as the dwarves, and Feedback was a buff which would drain mana and do damage to whoever attacked the priest with a spell while the buff was active. And finally, we have the Draenei, who had Symbol of Hope and Fear Ward, and Chastise as their racials. Fear Ward was made baseline to all priests, and they were given Chastise along with dwarves. And Symbol of Hope essentially gave everyone in the Draenei's party a fixed amount of mana every 5 seconds for 15 seconds on a 5-minute cooldown. Funny enough, this spell was eventually removed and then brought back in Legion as a priest talent, which allows the priest to channel for 10 seconds to allow all other healers in the raid to cast spells with no mana during the duration. And those were the only races that could be priests at the time, in case you wonder what racials Taurens had or whatever. Speaking of racial specific abilities, Paladins also had faction specific spells. Prior to the Burning Crusade, only Alliance players could be Paladins. But with the addition of Blood Elves to the Horde, the Paladin class became available to both sides. In an attempt to keep the factions separate, 2 faction-specific seals were added to the game. Alliance Paladins received the Seal of Vengeance, while Horde Paladins got Seal of Blood. Oddly enough, the 2 seals had completely different game mechanics. Seal of Vengeance was very similar to Seal the Truth ability Paladins had before Legion removed it, which was pretty much the default Ret Pally seal to use for max damage. Seal of Vengeance caused the Paladin's melee attacks to apply a stacking dot debuff to the target, which caused holy damage and increased the damage of judgment against the target. Seal of Blood caused the Paladin's weapon attacks to deal additional holy damage equal to a percentage of their weapon damage. Since it scaled off of weapon damage and provided consistent damage, it was widely considered to be the best Ret DPS seal. Interestingly enough, this seal had a backlash damage mechanic, where the Paladin took damage equal to 10% of the damage the seal dealt as well. Thus, it could occasionally be dangerous to the player and kill you sometimes. Flasks and elixirs could be used at the same time. But not only that, you could also have multiple elixirs up at the same time along with your flask, food buffs, and a few other random buffs. The normal raid buffs needed for Warlords of Draenor were 3 simple things: a flask, a food buff, and an augment rune. An average raid of about 3 hours or so would require about 3 flasks, 20 stacks of food, and runes if you didn't have the permanent one. Now let's take a look at the average raid buffs a caster had to bring with them to a raid in the Burning Crusade. 20 elixirs of master, which gave about plus 15 to all stats. Remember, elixirs do not last through death like flasks. 20 elixirs of major firepower, 20 elixirs of vitality, and 20 adept elixirs. Then you had to get 20 Rumsey Rum Black Label, because at the time you could stack elixirs, you could also stack certain food buffs, and Rumsey Rum Black Label gave extra stamina. But in order to get this drink, you had to go into Old Hillsbrad Foothills instance and then buy them from a vendor. Not the normal Hillsbrad, but the past version in the Caverns of Time. Or you could just farm the item out in the world otherwise. Then of course your normal food buff times 20 and 20 Flame Cap. Flame Caps were a weird herb you could gather in Zingamarch that wasn't used in any recipes, and instead had an on-use effect that gave you a chance to do a little extra fire damage with attacks, and a spell power buff for 1 minute. And last but not least, your 4 flasks of supreme power. So that's 4 different elixirs, 2 food buffs, 1 consumable, and 1 flask. And that's not including the potions. 20 flame caps, 20 superior wizard oil, 20 food buffs, 20 elixirs of mastery, 20 Rumsey Rum Black Label, 20 elixirs of major firepower, 20 elixirs of vitality, 20 adept elixirs, and 4 flasks of supreme power. The Burning Crusade was the last expansion with bosses that had straight up magic immunities. For those of you who don't know, lots of bosses in vanilla had lore-specific spell immunities, like how Ragnaros was immune to fire damage because he's made of fire. In the Burning Crusade, the Void Reaver in Tempest Keep was immune to poisons because it's a machine. TBC was also the last expansion with widespread use of resist gear. Wrath of the Lich King had some fights that were made easier with resist gear, like frost resist gear on tanks on Sindragosa, but it wasn't really mandatory. Then in Cataclysm, resist gear wasn't even really a thing, and only high-end raiding guilds would use resist trinkets on some fights. Then Blizzard just straight up removed resistances later on, making them less important each expansion since the Burning Crusade. The trash before Hydros in the Serpentine Caverns had too much health and took an unreasonable amount of time to kill. The trash also had about a 40-minute respawn timer, which usually meant you only had 20 minutes of attempts on Hydros before you had to start clearing the trash again. And since Hydros itself required tanks to get a set of frost resist gear, most guilds had to simply work on other bosses and keep clearing trash over and over. Because a decent set of frost resist gear was very time consuming to get, and the trash would just keep spawning until you killed Hydros. Several tier 5 bosses, which were unkillable, were stealth fixed with no official notification by Blizzard. So when the bosses were made killable, none of the top guilds were even trying them, and the first kills went to lesser known guilds. It may seem hard to believe that top guilds would simply stop working on bosses, but bosses like Lady Vash and Kel'Thas were literally unkillable in their first incarnation for months. And sometimes the top guilds who kept working on them, even though they were unkillable, would lose their world first kill simply because the fight was changed while they were asleep, or some other guild just happened to be in the right place at the right time and got the kill on the newly significantly easier boss. Some of the gear in Karazhan, one of the first raids you could do in the Burning Crusade, was actually worse than some heroic dungeon pieces, until Blizzard buffed the gear later on. Guild banks, daily quests, gems, and jewel crafting were all things added in the Burning Crusade. In vanilla, guilds would just trade everything with each other, gear didn't have gem slots, and since daily quests weren't a thing, getting gold for your average player in vanilla was actually quite difficult. With the introduction of daily quests in TBC, the average player could actually earn gold casually without having to farm or play the auction house. Despite being on the box and in the intro cinematic, Illidan wasn't the final boss of the expansion, and wasn't even in the final raid. This didn't happen again until Warlords of Draenor when Grom was promised to be the final fight, and it ended up being Archimonde at the last second. In fact, we save Grom and he helps us kill the final boss. Imagine if we ended up saving Illidan instead of fighting him, and then he helped us fight the Burning Legion. Sunwell, the last raid of the expansion, was one of the hardest raids ever. Muru and Kil'jaeden were some of the hardest bosses that were not unkillable ever put in the game, and both are in the same instance. Muru, who isn't even the final boss of the raid, is considered one of the hardest bosses ever made by many people who did the fight when it was current. In the Graveyard of Honored Hold in Hellfire Peninsula, there is a gravestone that, when you click on it, says, "Here lies the remains of a peon. Stout-hearted, he tried to fight, but only farted." The training dummies existed in the game since release, but they weren't made usable until Wrath of the Lich King. Next to the Horde Inn in Rath Dalaran, there is a sewer with an NPC at the bottom of it. It is only reachable by engineers using the wormhole generator, and you only have a small chance to go here with this wormhole generator as it's not guaranteed. In vanilla WoW, being a level 60 dwarf priest often meant an instant raid invite because of Fear Ward alone. Really, no matter what your gear was, because they just wanted that Fear Ward. Before hunter pets were normalized in a later patch in vanilla, all pets had different stats and attack speeds. There was a rare cat mob in the Badlands called Broken Tooth, who was considered the ultimate hunter pet because it had a 1-second attack speed before buffs. Until Wrath, all taunt abilities only had a 5-yard range. In Firelands, on screen, you'll see that there is a secret path that you can take in order to avoid the annoying trash before Bethelak, the spider boss. What's interesting about this little skip is that even though you're clearly out of bounds, there's a little ledge that allows you to get into the room, almost as if they created this piece just for people who might get stuck outside. Before Blood Elves were added to the game, the Alliance actually outnumbered the Horde on most realms. In Vanilla WoW, bosses only had 8 debuff slots. That meant that if a 9th debuff was added to the boss, it would just replace one of the existing slots. There is still technically a debuff limit on bosses, but it's at such a high cap that it's impossible to reach. Rogues had a poison brewing profession, and poisons had stacks which were spent on attacking, and they had to refresh poisons on their weapons during boss fights. Also, a lot of bosses were just straight up immune to poison, so they didn't have to worry about this. Magic in Warcraft requires spell speech. So all spells work like animes in that you have to declare your attacks for them to work. Well, excluding Full Metal Alchemists, obviously. You can't just snap your fingers and set things on fire. That's why silent effects stop you from using spells, but not physical abilities. Basically, all spells have a verbal component for any of you D&D players out there. Worgen are in fact not a curse, but a forbidden druid form called pack form, who were then transformed into hybrid humanoids when they used the Scythe of Elune to try and control pack form. Also, the original Worgens were night elves and not humans. Enchanting was originally created by the forest trolls. Then the High Elves stole their idea and improved it into what it is today. The Draenei crashed on Draenor nearly 1,000 years ago. The giant white rock in Nagrand is the spaceship they used when they crash landed. Before Retail WoW, Archbishop Benedictus, the last boss in the Hour of Twilight dungeon, led a revolt against Bolvar Fordragon, the current Lich King, and took his place as the faction leader of Stormwind temporarily. The Scourge invasion of the Third War killed 90% of the High Elfin population. And of the 10% that survived, 90% became the Blood Elves we know today. Although a 90% kill count is a near extinction level event, so I don't know why they came up with those numbers specifically. The Gilnean battleground takes place on the coast for a good reason. The Forsaken are completely pushed out of Gilneas, as experienced in their quest, and the battleground is all about them trying to secure a port so they can stage a new invasion. Azeroth was all of one giant continent until the shattering of the Well of Eternity, which created the Maelstrom and split the continent into its parts. Death Knights were originally created by Gul'dan during the Second War and not by the Lich King. However, after the Orcs lost the Second War, Kil'jaeden did steal a few of the Death Knights created by Gul'dan and gave them to Arthas for use during the Third War, after which the Lich King did in fact start making his own. Also, Arthas was the first person ever to become a Death Knight without actually dying first. If you've ever leveled up in Dragonblight, you've probably noticed this giant dragon skeleton half buried in the snow. This dragon is called Galakron. Galakron is the reason there are 5 dragon aspects in the first place. He went around eating other dragons, and the other dragons decided to team up in order to stop him. After 3 battles, the 5 dragon aspects were able to beat him, and then some Titan Keepers thought it'd be a good idea to give those 5 dragons magic powers, so they'd be better equipped to stop something like Galakron from happening again in the future. The Goon Squad, a guild famously known for their in-game pranks, have a unique accomplishment to their name. They were the only Horde guild to ever kill Thrall. How, you ask? Well, back in vanilla, there was a quest in Stone Talon, part of which had a quiz, where getting a wrong answer gave you a debuff that made you hostile with your own faction for 15 minutes. Goon Squad rounded up a bunch of their raiding best, deliberately debuffed themselves, and set off to Orgrimmar to test it out. Blizzard fixed the quest shortly after the exploit was discovered, knocking the debuff down to 5 minutes and reducing all stats by 50% rather than turning you hostile. During alpha, they only intended to have 200 quests total in the game, 100 for each side. They wanted to have quests supplement grinding and not be the means of leveling, but players like quest, so they added more. But not enough, as you generally couldn't reach level 60 by just doing quests. For a long time, it was thought that once you got around to level 50, you would eventually run out of quests and had to grind. However, with Classic WoW's introduction in 2017, we did kind of find out that wasn't 100% true, and you could quest all the way to 60, just as long as you had proper guides. Alchemists could create flasks only in alchemy labs. There were only 2 in the game in Vanilla WoW. One in Skullman's, and the second one was in Blackwing Lair. So they had to go there each time they wanted to create a flask, so they just weren't used that much in original vanilla, even though everybody used them in Classic WoW. In Firelands, there's a secret path that involves very minor wall jumping that could take you around some really annoying trash straight to the spider boss. An NPC named Oglethorpe Obnocticus can be found in Booty Bay. He's a reference to Oglethorpe, one of the really stupid Plutonian aliens from Aquitian Hunger Force, and their source of knowledge, Orbinocticus, a giant disco ball that Oglethorpe insists is actually a supercomputer. Over the course of WoW, hunters have had 10 different aspects. Aspect of the hawk, monkey, beast, iron hawk, dragon hawk, cheetah, pack, viper, fox, and aspect of the wild. Some additions, such as slash raid warning, the ability to mark mobs, and threat meters, were only available with specific add-ons before Blizzard added them themselves. During the Cataclysm beta, Blizzard added a mob called Epic Maximus, which was flying above the Maelstrom. In the Dreadways questline, you help free all of the Paragons of the Galaxy and learn about their history. Then, in the Siege of Orgrimmar, you have to kill all of them, including one of the bugs that you help grow during a series of daily quests. When Death Knights were first added to Wrath, they were extremely overpowered. They had a talent called Shadow of Death, which turned them into a ghoul when they died, that worked in arenas. Glyph of Death and Decay had a random chance to horror whoever took damage for it for 2 seconds. They could turn themselves into an undead with Lichborn and heal themselves back to full 2 times over with their Death Coil glyph. Chains of Ice would slow movement speed by 90% and would go down as the spell went on, giving them the best slow ever. And that was the nerfed version of it. And on top of all this, they just dealt massive damage. Before the Shaman ability Fire Nova, there was a totem called Fire Nova Totem that once dropped started a 5-second timer. After 5 seconds, it would explode, doing a ton of damage and stunning everyone caught in its blast radius. In early Wrath, you could only change out glyphs with a Lexicon of Power that are located next to the Scribe Trainers. Before BC, there were no guild banks. So most guilds just use low-level characters to store everything that the guild needed. The Duskwood Night Watch Militia is a reference to the Night's Watch from the Game of Thrones, as they both share similar names and fight the undead. The low-level rams and wolves in Arteric Valley were added so that lower-level players who joined the battle would kill them to level up and upgrade friendly troops with the turn-ins that they would drop. The word min-maxing pretty much didn't exist during vanilla raiding because Blizzard had no idea what class balance was. Also, most people weren't using any rotations at all, seeing as half the abilities players had were useless. Of course, after Classic released, they kind of figured out this wasn't true and there absolutely was a meta that you could min-max. Hunters in the Burning Crusade could macro their entire rotation into one button and then bind it to a scroll wheel. In Undercity, there's a butler named Harshbringer Balthazar. His name is a reference to Balthazar, Romeo's servant and trusted friend who serves the Montagu family. He can be found walking around the 4 Montagu bankers. Before Cataclysm, all classes had weapon skills which factored into your chance to hit and land glancing blows. And weapon skills took an extremely long time to level. Each time a shaman did a talent tree respec from enhancement, they would lose all their weapon skills in 2-handed maces and axes, because they were a talent in the enhancement tree. Tauren is an anagram for nature. Warlocks were able to summon people into battlegrounds, including people out of the level bracket. There is a huge smiley face below Karazhan. Wintergrass was originally supposed to have aerial combat. You can still see it on the back of the Wrath of Lich King expansion box. There is a gnome in the gardens of Castle Stormwind by the name of Tyrion, which is a reference to Tyrion Lannister, the imp from A Game of Thrones. There is an axe called Arcanite Reaper. This weapon was famous during vanilla because of its 3.8 weapon speed, which was only 0.2 off of being absolutely the slowest, which made it extremely powerful in the hands of warriors and enhancement shamans, where lots of their abilities would be based on how much damage their weapon could do. So the slower the better. It's now the heirloom axe that we have today. Nazgrim was a horde quest giver for 3 different zones before he became a boss in the Siege of Orgrimmar. PvP trinkets were class specific and only removed 3 forms of CC depending on your class. For example, for a priest it would only remove fears, stuns, and polymorphs. For hunters, it would only remove stuns, roots, and slows, and for druids, it would only remove charms, fears, and stuns. There is an NPC next to Harris Pilton in Chatrat City called Rickhold Nichi that is only viewable by priests who have the Eye of Divinity equipped. The best level 60 warrior DPS item was a pair of level 49 mail gloves, because they had weapon skill bonuses on them that greatly reduced the chance of landing glancing blows. If you enter the house north of Goldshire at 7:40 a.m., you will see 5 children forming a pentagram. You can hear banshee screams, creepy music, and Cthulhu sound files saying that you will die. In the Wrath pre-patch, Readiness, a marksman talent that reset all your cooldowns, was moved down the tree, making it possible to grab along with Bestial Wrath. At the time, Bestial Wrath lasted 18 seconds and gave the hunter and their pet CC immunity. So for a short while, hunters could be CC immune for almost 40 seconds straight in PvP. Paladin blessings lasted 5 minutes, so by the time you buffed 40 people in your raid, the first one you buff would only have 2 to 3 minutes left on their blessings. So Paladins were essentially just rebuffing their raid all the time. In the tunnel before the Undercity throne room, you can see rose petals that people threw on Arthas before he killed his father. You can also see blood on the floor where his crown fell after being stabbed. It used to be that you weren't able to see buffs on enemy players. That's why mages had the Detect Magic spell. While shielded with an absorption effect like Power Word Shield, a tanking warrior druid would not gain rage. This wasn't fixed all the way until early Wrath of the Lich King. You used to be able to communicate cross-faction by using lines to make words. In beta, Power Word Shield and Power Word Fortitude were called Holy Word Shield and Holy Word Fortitude, but Blizzard decided they wanted Pallies to have all the cool holy word names, and so they changed the priest to have power words instead. In vanilla, there's a class quest chain in order to get the most powerful bow in the game. The quest required you to go around and search for 4 demons that were rare spawns and defeat them, but you couldn't have anyone else around you or your pet out to fight them. Each demon had a special ability that could only be countered with one of the hunter abilities. Clinfran, the Crazed, would hit super hard and enrage periodically, which could be dispelled with Scorpion Sting, which also made him do only 1 damage. Simone the Seductress would slowly cast a lightning bolt that could be silenced with Viper Sting. Selenor the Slayer could be rooted for 30 seconds with Wing Clip. The Doombringer would put a debuff on you that would kill you almost instantly if within 30 yards of him. His weakness was taking super crazy amounts of damage from Serpent Sting. Rogue poisons used to have stacks, so it was not uncommon for rogues to have to reapply poisons mid-boss fight. That was if the boss wasn't just straight up immune to poisons, which most of them were. For a short time in Wrath of the Lich King, Sweeping Strikes worked with Bladestorm and allowed each hit to land twice. This, combined with an armor penetration trinket, allowed warriors to hit up to 10 times on the same target with 100% armor pen in less than 6 seconds, making Bladestorm completely overpowered before it was fixed. Before Wrath, bosses had spell immunities and resisted spell damage. For example, bosses like Ragnaros were immune to all fire spells, and mechanical bosses were immune to all poisons. For a short time at the beginning of Cataclysm, there was an exploit in the game where hunters could have both Aspect of the Hawk and Aspect of the Fox up at the same time. Malkorok, one of the bosses in the Siege of Orgrimmar and head of the Kor'kron, killed the undead and Blood Elf ambassadors after his spies told him that they were bad-talking Garrosh behind his back over the bombing of Theramore. Before patch 3.0.2, rogues had their own class-specific profession where they could make their own poisons. Although never confirmed, there is a rumor that the Ironforge Air Station was supposed to be a gnome starting area, although this was actually recently confirmed in the fact that this is not true at all, and in fact it was created specifically to be just eye candy that you would see while on a flight path. The Destruction Warlock rotation of the Burning Crusade consisted of just sacrificing your pet and spamming Shadow Bolt and doing nothing else. In Undercity, there are 2 chemists with Fuli and Cooley in their names. Their names are an obvious reference to the anime series FLCL, or Fooly Cooley. In vanilla, Paladin seals were 30-second buffs that gave them an effect which would be consumed by Judgment for a different effect. For example, a Paladin might cast Seal of the Crusader, which increased attack speed at the cost of lower weapon damage, immediately cast Judgment, which would place a debuff on the target, increasing their holy damage taken, then cast Seal of Righteousness, which made melee attacks deal additional holy damage, and Judge on cooldown until they had to refresh Judgment to the Crusader buff. At launch, there was absolutely no quests in Silithus, or anything important at all. Also, during Alpha, they only intended to have 200 quests total in the game, 100 for each leveling side. They wanted to have quests supplement grinding, and not be the means of leveling up by itself. But during those early stages, players liked quests, so they added more, but not really enough, as it was possible for a lot of people to run out by the time they hit 60, so a lot of people would start grinding around the 50s until later on people properly developed guides that let them actually quest to max level. Dark Cleric Salem's Chest was a chest in the game that required the key to Salem's Chest to open. The thing is, this key was never put into the game. The chest was never opened before it was removed during Cataclysm. There is an item called the Intricate Treasure Chest Key that says in its flavor text, does not open Dark Cleric Salem's Chest, hinting that Blizzard did know about the chest and never decided to do anything about it. It's speculated the chest was supposed to be part of a priest or warrior class quest chain, which was abandoned in beta, but they forgot to remove the chest part of the quest that stayed in the game for over 3 expansions. There is a crypt behind Karazhan, which is currently inaccessible. It used to be that you could res on the other side of the gate blocking it off until Blizzard put an invisible wall in. Now you can only get in by exploiting the game. What's inside the crypts? Well, during Legion, they actually let you go inside the crypt, which was not really something when this video originally aired, so all the footage that was gathered was done through some kind of mount trick where you have to get up and then dismount on a mammoth near the wall, which you can use to get it into a lot of places. Chris Metzen is the voice actor of a whole bunch of people in World of Warcraft, including Thrall, Rexxar, Sourfang Jr. and Sr., Varian Wrynn, Algalon, Deathwing, Nefarian, Ragnaros, Bronjon, Vol'jin, Garrosh Hellscreen, Hakar, Satheron, Yogg-Saron, the Male Worgen, various Orc NPCs, and many, many more. In Old War, there was a player who was accidentally sent a shirt called Martin's Fury after getting his account restored. He then went and used it to get record kill times on a few bosses. Him and everyone else in his guild got a permaban, but today Blizzard probably would have just given them a temporary ban instead. There were 3 levels to the rest system in beta: Rested, Tired, and Exhausted. Rested gave you 100% experience, Tired gave you 75%, and Exhausted only gave you 50%. Resting only worked in inns, not just in cities, and not at all in the wild. You were actually punished for playing too long, and it was designed to keep you from playing one character too long and to encourage rotating characters to your alts. After a ton of complaints, they switched it to 100% normal, 150% rested, then finally settled on 100% normal and 200% rested. Meeting stones originally weren't used for summoning people, they were used so you can look for other people who queued for that instance. Until Wrath of the Lich King, Sylvanas used a modified Night Elf model. In the early Wrath beta, they used a Blood Elf model instead with red eyes, before they then finally started giving faction leaders their own specific models instead of just generic models for their races. In Beta WoW, Kitty Druids had an ability called Play Dead that was an instant threat dump, which was then removed and given to hunters under the name Feign Death. There was a bug vanilla WoW where at the end of the 6-minute Feign Death timer, the hunter would actually die. And back then, there were no quick hotfixes, and you had to wait until a patch for any bug to be fixed like this. Outlands, the Emerald Dream, and player housing were all planned and in development in vanilla WoW. The files for the Emerald Dream still exist in the game files. Hellfire Peninsula was originally supposed to be a 56 to 60 zone, and 2 examples of guild housing still exist in the game today, the house on Geum Island and Ravenhold Manor. For an update in the future, Outlands was added in the Burning Crusade, the Emerald Dream was added during Dragonflight, and player housing has yet to be added to the game. Discipline was supposed to be the melee tree for priests, similar to how monks worked in other games. And because of this, Inner Fire increased attack power along with armor, but priests had no melee attacks at all. They did have a talent that increased the damage they did with wands though, and Disc wasn't all that useful in vanilla besides going for its meditation talent. But having a useless spec in vanilla wasn't really that uncommon. Just look at survival hunters and balanced druids for example. Also, another fun fact, warriors who tanked generally went Fury because Prot wasn't that good, and the Warlock class as a whole was useless until a few patches into vanilla where they had to buff everything in order to make them viable. Also, an update to this old script, we actually found out why Discipline Priests had melee attack power buffs, and that's because in vanilla WoW, they just kind of gave classes random things and they had no intention of making Disc Priests actual melee fighters. They just gave them an attack power buff just because they thought it would be cool. In beta, Tauren were originally given the Plains Running ability in place of mounts. Plains Running gave you the same mount speed as other classes at the appropriate level, but it was super inconvenient. You had to run for 10 seconds straight to get your Plains Running kicking in. And if you were hit by anything while running, your speed boost would end immediately. Other mounts didn't dismount you on just any damage, and other mounts only had a 3-second cast time instead of a 10-second ramp up, so they just removed it. Funnily enough, they pretty much gave this ability to Worgen in Cataclysm without all of the terrible restrictions. Epic mounts at release were just recolored normal mounts without armor. Then in patch 1.4, they removed the recolored mounts and added the armored versions that we have today, making the old recolored versions some of the most rarest mounts in the game. Undead were able to communicate with Alliance for a while at the beginning of vanilla. Undead are all pretty much raised humans, so it fits with the lore. Undead were also classified as undead in beta, so they could be targeted by things like old school exorcism, shackle undead, holy wrath, and turn evil. Also, Will of the Forsaken, Undead's racial ability, was a passive buff which just made you straight up immune to sleep, polymorph, and fear effects at all times. Spell schools used to have a skill system similar to how weapon systems used to work, where your skill in fire would increase to 93 for example, but then they removed that before vanilla went live. Wind Fairy weapons could proc off of each other, and because of this, shamans were a little bit OP in PvP, seeing as they could randomly one-shot their opponents. Plus, Frost Shock actually hit hard and Earth Shock just had a baked-in interrupt, so shamans would randomly interrupt casters by just doing their normal rotations. In Classic WoW though in 2017, where everybody had optimized their gear and specs, shamans were no longer a feared thing like they were in the original vanilla. When the Paladin Reckoning talent was first introduced, there was no cap on how many charges it could store. So a Paladin stored 1,816 charges of Reckoning and used it to solo a world boss in 5 seconds, making Paladins the most overpowered class ever for 24 hours before it was fixed to only store 4 charges. In vanilla, Hunters and Warlock pets did not scale with any of your stats at all. Healing and spell damage were 2 separate stats. So there were separate stats, like spell power, which gave spell damage, and healing power, which increased your healing, and of course a non-named stat, which increased both your spell damage and spell healing, which was called increase your spell damage and your spell healing. The term globaled, which people often say when they get killed very fast in PvP, doesn't actually exist anymore. But in vanilla, in the time of no resilience, mages could actually kill people in a single global cooldown. What they did was use a macro that activated double spell power trinkets, Presence of Mind, a skill that makes your next spell instant cast, and Pyroblast, which used to have a 7-second cast time. If that Pyroblast critted, it could kill anyone in any gear with 1 hit. Tauren is an anagram for nature. Warlocks were able to summon people into battlegrounds, including people out of the level bracket. There is a click to move option in WoW. You can click on a spot on the ground and your character will move to that spot like you're in an RTS game. There is a huge smiley face below Karazhan if you're able to get underneath it. Wintergrass was supposed to have aerial combat. You can see it on the back of the Wrath of Lich King expansion box. Warlock succubus pets used to have less clothing, but then they added more later on. There were 4 trinket slots back in WoW's original alpha build before they decided to go with 2. You can equip items onto your character by dragging and dropping the items onto your character's portrait. Before Wrath of the Lich King, Battlegrounds did not give experience. In lore, Tedrassil is supposed to look like this giant tree, but because of in-game limitations, the player is meant to believe they are in the boughs of the tree. In beta, there were shields and bucklers. Rogues and hunters could use bucklers, but they later removed them. And rogues and hunters couldn't equip shields anymore. There were still bucklers in the game before Cataclysm, but they were just labeled as shields. For a short while, all polearms were also called spears. The best level 60 warrior DPS item was a pair of level 49 mail gloves, because they had weapon skill bonuses on them, which greatly reduced the chance of glancing blows. There is an NPC next to Harris Pilton in Shatrat City called Rikol Nichi that is only viewable by priests who have the Eye of Divinity trinket equipped. In the Burning Crusade beta, there was a quest reward dagger in the Netherstorm that dealt arcane damage instead of physical. It scaled with spell damage, so for a short while, mages could hit really hard in melee. PvP trinkets were class specific and only removed 3 forms of CC depending on your class. For example, for a priest, it would only remove fears, stuns, and polymorph. For hunters, it would only remove stuns, roots, and slows, and for druids, it would only remove charms, fears, and stuns. The very first legendary item that dropped was a necklace called the Talisman of Binding Shard. This dropped off of Baron Geddon and was later removed from the loot table, but the player who got it was allowed to keep it. Warlocks in Alpha WoW and early beta used to wear leather armor instead of cloth. The emblem of Triumph vendors at the Trial of the Crusader portal are named Izmode and Facerol. which are obviously referencing easy mode and face roll, which are jokes by Blizzard about paladins being easy to play, which was very true before holy power was introduced in Cataclysm. There is an axe called the Arcanide Reaper. This weapon was infamous during vanilla because of its 3.8 weapon speed, which made it extremely powerful in the hands of warriors and enhancement shamans. It is now the heirloom axe we have today. Before Wrath, all priests had racial spells in addition to their baseline racials, but some of them were turned into baseline priest abilities and others were removed. For example, Undead had Devouring Plague, Dwarfs and Draenei had Chastise, which later became Holy Word Chastise, and Draenei alone had Symbol of Hope, which became Hymn of Hope. Paladin Blessings lasted 5 minutes, so by the time you buffed 40 raid members, the first ones you buffed would only have 2 to 3 minutes left on their blessings. So Paladins were essentially just rebuffing the raid all the time. In Alpha WoW, there was a profession called Survival Skills. It was used for making campfires, which can now be made with cooking, and torches. Those torches were used for scouting. Back then, the graphic engine was a little bit different. Darker areas, such as Duskwood, were really dark, and you couldn't see anything past 20 to 30 yards in front of you. Torches were used to increase visibility in those darker areas. Many NPCs in Duskwood still hold torches in their hands to this day. Warlocks were able to summon people off of cliffs, and mages were able to CC people underwater long enough to make them drown. Blizzard used to balance raids around classes having restricted roles. Only warriors could tank, priests were by far the best healers, druids were there to innervate the priest, shamans were used mostly as out-of-combat rezzers, and paladins were usually busy rebuffing the raid. Druids, paladins, and warlocks had no viable DPS specs at all. A few patches into vanilla though, warlocks were finally made playable by a string of buffs. There were bosses that were completely immune to some schools of magic, like poison. Mages had to raid Molten Core with Frostback, and rogues lost quite a bit of DPS on poison-immune bosses, which were very plentiful. Some raid additions, such as /raid warning, the ability to mark mobs and threat meters, wait 3 sunders, were only available with specific add-ons before Blizzard finally added them to the game itself. In beta, shamans and priests were the classes that had combat resurrection spells instead of druids. It was given to druids because shamans were a horde-only class, and removed from priests because they were already the best healers, and it would give druids utility outside of just innervate. Hunters in the Burning Crusade could macro their entire rotation into one button, and bind it to a mouse scroll. I should also mention that the Destruction Warlock rotation in the Burning Crusade consisted of just spamming Shadow Bolt and nothing else. The word min-maxing pretty much didn't exist during vanilla raiding, and most classes didn't have a DPS rotation to speak of. Hunters would use 3 shots and then go out of mana, then feign death and drink or auto attack, which they spent most of their time doing. Also, during raid boss fights, as long as you didn't touch the boss, get hit by an ability, or heal someone in combat, you were considered not in combat. That's why hunters could drink mid-raid, and most raids made a healer stay out of combat the whole fight just to res people who died. In the Goblin starting zone, at one of the gas stations, there is a small group of Goblin supermodels who are all ridiculously good looking, having a gasoline fight with a disco ball in between them. This is a very obvious nod towards the beginning of the Zoolander film, where all of his friends die in a freak gasoline fight which could not have been prevented. In the Badlands, there is a secret crypt inside of the mountain with a skeleton sitting on a chair with a sword next to him. This is a reference to Conan the Barbarian when Conan enters a crypt and takes a sword from a corpse. Then the corpse comes to life and attacks him, and the only way Conan can kill him is by throwing him into a pit of fire. One of the more fun and obvious to see Easter egg in the game takes place in Shatrath. There is an orc named Crow Threadstrong who is constantly yelling and taunting a human fruit vendor who doesn't really know what's going on. In Nagrand, there is a floating island with an apple tree and a skeleton with an axe through its head. This is speculated to be Newton's tree, and he was killed before he could discover gravity, and that's why there are floating pieces of land everywhere. And by speculated, I mean very much made up by the WoW community. In the Terakar Forest, there is a moth named Naphthalar. Naphthalene is an aromantic hydrocarbon and the main ingredient in making mothballs. In the Sholzar Basin on a small island, there is a little hatch with a mouse over text that has all the numbers from the secret code in Lost +1. On a lone mountain off the coast of the Jade Forest, there is a house with a whole bunch of balloons on the top. Inside the house is a grumpy old panda and a lucky dude with a big backpack and a dog named Dig. This is all probably a reference to a movie called Up about a man who flies around with his balloon house with an annoying kid and a dog named Doug. In Undercity, there's a room with a bunch of human prisoners in it. Next to one of the cages is an alchemist who hands a potion to one of the prisoners. The man gets turned into a frog, a squirrel, rabbit, and then a sheep. When he turns into a sheep, he pokes it repeatedly and then the sheep explodes. This is a reference to Warcraft 2 and 3, where if you clicked on a sheep and other critters enough times, they would engulf in flames and explode. Off the shore Booty Bay, there is a giant statue on a small island. If you look inside the head of the statue, there is a ton of pirate treasure along with a few dead bodies. In the middle of the Lake Dumont in Feralis, there's a small island with a destroyed mage tower and various NPCs, each named after a person from one of the Blizzard development team. In WoW's solar system, at the time of making this video originally, there were 8 named planets. Azeroth, where World of Warcraft takes place, Draenor, the home of the orcs, Argus, the original homeworld of the Draenei, Zoroth, home to the infernal dreadsteeds that the Warlock summon, Karesh, the ethereal homeworld which was devoured or conquered by Dementius, Xandros, a Legion-destroyed planet players were temporarily visiting in World of Draenor, Zerath, which is mentioned in Mist of Pandaria as a world that was destroyed as a show of power by the Burning Legion during the enslavement of Zoroth. And then there's Fanlin Deskor, another world that was wiped clean of life by the Legion in one of Velen's visions. Someone once did the math to figure out the size of Kalimdor in the Eastern Kingdoms in real life, and it came out to 80 square miles combined, each continent coming out to 40 square miles each. The island of Manhattan in New York has 20 square miles, for example, making it half the size of a World of Warcraft continent. If I were to take a guess, I'd say Northrend is around 2/3 the size of the continents, and Pandaria is about half, making Northrend about 27 square miles and Pandaria about 20 square miles, for a total of 127 square miles of landmass. The Isle of Wight, a small island in the channel between the UK and the European continent, is 146 square miles, and thus bigger than World of Warcraft. Azeroth is a pretty small place. It should be noted the planet is supposed to be a lot larger in lore. With the launch of Rift, there was an ad campaign stating, "We're not in Azeroth anymore," as kind of a challenge to WoW and its hopeful attempt to overthrow WoW and be the new big MMO on the market. Well, this did not happen, and WoW is still number 1 by a pretty large margin. Although Rift is still doing well with its free-to-play model, or at least it was when this video first went live like 10 years ago. WoW has many different political structures on both Horde and Alliance. Night Elves are a theocracy, where the High Priestess and the Sisterhood hold supreme political power. There was some competition with the Druids, but after a series of scandals, it's pretty obvious the Sisterhood of Elune holds ultimate power. Humans and Morgans are feudal monarchies, with aristocratic councils and local elected councils. Dwarves are a traditionalistic monarchy. The Horde are mostly led by chieftains ruled by War Chief Vol'jin, or at least that was the case when this video first went live. What makes the War Chief the leader is his power and the fact people choose to follow him. There aren't any written rules on this. The Blood Elves seem to be part monarchy, at least, being led by a regent right now. They await a true leader. Gnomes are a technocratic republic, meaning they elect their leaders based mostly on the skills they show in their respective fields, i.e. engineering. And the Draenei are a theocracy with a local oligarchic council. 10,000 years ago, when Queen Azshara was the ruler of the Night Elves, there was an elite magic-using sect known as the Highborn, who dabbled in magics that many other elves considered heretical by drawing upon the power of the Well of Eternity. At the order of Queen Azshara, they opened a series of portals triggering the War of the Ancients. Sometime after the Great Sundering, most of the surviving Highborn were exiled from Kalimdor and settled in the eastern continent, founding the Kingdom of Quel'Thalas. They became known as High Elves. Their purple skin eventually faded to a pale peach color like that of some humans and dwarves. 90% of the High Elves died when Arthas corrupted the Sunwell in his siege of Quel'Thalas. Of the 10% who survived, 90% decided to call themselves Blood Elves in memory of the ridiculous amount of casualties from the Third War, and those are the same Blood Elves that are now part of the Horde. There are quite a few NPCs dedicated to deceased players. One that really sticks out for me is Ahab Wheathoof, as he is in the Torrhen starting area, and that's where I made my first character. At the time, I thought he sounded way different than all the other NPCs, and it's because he was voiced by Ezra Chatterton, a young player with cancer who got to spend a day at Blizzard headquarters thanks to the Make-A-Wish Foundation. He got to create Ahab Wheathoof, voice Ahab, and create the quest Kyle's Gone Missing to go with him, among other things. He passed away in October of 2008 when his tumor, which had been in remission, came back. Azeroth has 2 moons, the larger White Lady and the smaller Blue Child. If you played somewhere between the Burning Crusade and Cataclysm and didn't read outside game sources, You wouldn't have known that the blue child even existed. It disappeared for years in BC for graphical errors, and only recently in Mist of Pandaria returned to the in-game night skies. Every several hundred years, the blue child passes over the white lady in a rare event called the Embrace. What this means in astronomical terms is that the blue child must be in reality freakishly small and close to Azeroth, and the white lady must be even more freakishly huge and further away, perhaps bigger than Azeroth itself for this to be possible. This is going with the assumption that the orbits of the two planetary objects are stable, and their distance to Azeroth doesn't fluctuate dramatically. There are 7 major religions in WoW. Church of the Holy Light, which is a religion devoted to worshipping the light. No one really knows where the church gets its power from, but one who denies that it is real has either never seen a priest heal or a paladin cleanse. Worship of Elune. Elune is one of the few deities that is actually known to exist in the world. She is one of the most powerful Eternals in Azeroth, and her symbol is that of the crescent moon. Mystery of the Makers. This is a dwarven religion which focuses on where they came from, why they are here, and what they're supposed to be doing. Followers of the Old Gods. The followers of the Old Gods are mostly comprised of Naga, Elementals, Karaji, and Nerubians, although a few mortals have heard the whisperings of the Old Gods and have gone mad because of it, including Deathwing and Queen Ajara. Loa worship. This is the religion of the Trolls. The Trolls draw power from their voodoo magics by invoking the Loa, the Earth Mother, which is the god of the Tauren. She is the creator of life and everything. The sun, Anshi, and the white lady moon, Musha, are her eyes. Cult of the Forgotten Shadows, which is a religion of the Forsaken, and is a corrupted form of the Church of the Holy Light. The Warlords of Draenor expansion can be explained by 2 time-traveling theories. Alternate timeline theory, the timeline we go to is just a branch off of our current timeline, where everything is exactly the same as our timeline except for a few minor changes. What this means is that the timeline we go to will have a new alternative path, and our timeline will continue on the same path because we didn't go back on our timeline, but a different similar one. As an update to this video being made 10 years later, yes, this was the case. Now to continue, there's also the multiverse theory, where we simply teleport to another dimension that is similar to ours but taking place at a different point in time. The line that the arrow points to started after our timeline, so crossing over into it will put us in their present, which is about 30 years in our past. The other 3 lines on the timeline taking place in the future. So if we went to one of those timelines, we'd be technically going into the future. When it comes to the technology of WoW, it seems to be in the technological stage of the early 1900s, as Henry Ford mass-produced the Model T in 1908. And World of Warcraft has an abundance of functioning vehicles, although other inventions might point at an even further along point of progression. If we take the turbo flying machine into account, that puts them up to 1937 when the first jet engine was invented, although we can go even further. In the 1960s, the laser was invented by Theodore Harold Maiman, and you can see laser beams being used by siegecrafter Blackfuse in the Siege of Orgrimmar. If you take the rocket mount into account, you can push the age of technological advance to 1969 when the US put the first person on the moon, or even further since they have technologies that we don't have in the form of dimensional portals and shrink rays. All that to say is that World of Warcraft should be able to easily start using fighter planes and atomic bombs with their level of technology.